You can't do that. Oh, you can't wear that. God forbid. God forbid a white boy get a little bit of motion. Everybody loses their minds. You see, this is how crazy Batman's made Gotham. And it changes. Starting tonight, I will be wearing the silky with the bust-down AP. Louis V loafers. And this ain't Moissanite. Believe me, I'm a man of my word.
How's it going? So yesterday, if you tuned in, I did a stream, basically the same stream I'm going to do today. I went back and I watched a little bit, like I just kind of watched the first few minutes, and I noticed that there was a crazy echo. The echo was like terrible, wild, like unlistenable. So I spent this morning trying to troubleshoot it, try to figure out what's going on. I thought like maybe it's echo in the room. I am recording in a small space. So it wasn't that. Thought maybe it was the cord on my Blue Yeti, that maybe it had, I don't know, jostled into a weird position, caused a weird feedback of some sort or something. I don't know. Wasn't that. Turns out what it was is there was an extra microphone source that OBS was recording and picking up. And it was hidden in my audio mixer, so I didn't see it. So the entire time, it was just two microphone audio inputs or whatever. So anyways, we're going to do this stream all over again. Unfortunately, it's kind of annoying for me, but I thought the topic was important. I liked all the things that I talked about yesterday, and you know, I want them to be represented on my channel, so we're just going to do it all over again. So that's the bad part. On the plus side, because I already went through this once, I could maybe be a little bit more efficient with my time and everything that I wanted to say and get out. So what we're going to be covering is we're going to be reviewing this debate between Pisco. You see him here, he's on the right. And then who's known as AJW, the thumb person in the middle, actual Justice Warrior. Actual name is Sean Fitzgerald. And then the host of the show, Brad Polumbo on the left. I think he's a little bit more of a conservative-leaning guy. But it's very rare for me to say this, but I actually have a decent amount of respect for him. I think that he's a good faith operator. I don't agree with a lot of things. I think there's a lot of things he doesn't really see. But I do think he's very good faith. I think he's willing to listen and be considerate of concerns that people on the liberal left end have. He's very explicitly anti-Trump, anti-MAGA. It doesn't mince words about kind of how corrupt and crazy it is. So I appreciate that. I listened to this already when I was driving. And so when I was listening, I was thinking this would be a good jumping off point for stream to talk about the topic of gerrymandering. As you guys might have heard, there's a lot of stuff going on with like Supreme Court gerrymandering case. A lot of Republican states are moving to eliminate their black majority districts. And there's the issue with Virginia's gerrymander, which was a Democratic gerrymander that was overturned by the Virginia state legislature, or I'm sorry, state legislature, Virginia Supreme Court. And so for a little bit of context, let's first talk a little bit about what's going on with the gerrymandering. So gerrymandering, how about this? Illinois versus Calais? Illinois versus Calais? Or is it Louisiana? Louisiana, okay. So there's a ruling that just got handed down by the Supreme Court a few days ago. And so what the Supreme Court did with this ruling is they overturned a part of the Voting Rights Act. And keep in mind, if you're not aware, if you're a foreigner, if you just don't really know too much about the history, the Voting Rights Act was one of the landmark legislations that Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement had fought for. So think about that for a minute. we hold Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement up as like, national heroes and everything. You'll have a lot of Republican people on the right will play lip service to supporting MLK and liking MLK. And then here they are kind of like spitting in the face of everything that he lived and died trying to do. And so the point of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. There was the Civil Rights Act and there was the Voting Rights Act. The purpose of the Voting Rights Act was in the post-Confederate, in the fallout from the Confederacy and the Confederate States, which, if you're not aware, this is what the map of the U.S. looked like at the time of the Civil War. And the states in red are the states that had seceded from the country and joined the Confederacy. The states in the blue here were still part of the United States, part of the Union. The ones in light blue, I forget exactly. I think they were taking like a neutral stance or something along those lines. I don't remember exactly, but you get the idea. So after the Civil War, you had the era that we call the Jim Crow era. And during the Jim Crow era, you had people, all these, black Americans who were emancipated. They were freed from slavery. And here we go. That's what I was trying to look for. So they were freed from slavery. And you might be thinking like, okay, well, everything's said and done, right? Like, we're all good now. Well, no, not really, because they then found themselves in a situation, a dynamic that we call in American history the Jim Crow era. And it's an era where, on paper, black Americans were emancipated, they were free, they weren't slaves anymore. But in reality, in the South, in the states that were Confederate states that had seceded, they maintained a system of basically apartheid. Basically, you have, your white citizens who have full rights and representation, even though that's not 100% true. Like, women still didn't have the right to vote. There's other issues there, but the black citizens of those states, they were segregated against, which means they were kept out of economic opportunity. You have to imagine, right? These are people who were slaves for all of their life. Now they're free. How do you expect them to build up wealth, to have jobs? You're basically asking a group of people who have never been given a chance at education, who haven't been given any tools to, build their own businesses, have their own trades. They've been kept in, poverty and, ignorance because they don't get education and everything. And then you're expecting these people to, what now? Like, they're supposed to just magically out of nowhere all just become competent business leaders who have all the skills for all these different industries so that they can carve out an economic space for themselves in the post-Confederate United States. I mean, there's another aspect to that too, which is that if the white population in the South was already in control of all the industry and all the trades, not only are you as a slave or somebody who was a slave, not only are you now trying to build up some kind of economic opportunity and wealth for your community out of like literally nothing, you're given nothing. If you don't know this, you don't know this part of U.S. American history, the slaves, after they were emancipated, after they were freed, they were given nothing. The government didn't go, oh, hey, we kept you guys in slavery for generations. Like, here, we're going to give you some sort of reparations. We're going to give you like a couple $1,000s or something, which at that time might have been a lot of money, right? But I'm just saying, like, they weren't like, okay, well, it's really unfair what happened to you. We're setting you free now, but we're going to try to set you up for success. No, they basically took these people and like just put them ass out on the street. Good luck, right? You have no jobs, you have no skills, you have no education. all of the white citizens in the state own all the property, they own all the land, they own all the industry, they already have all the trades. How are you going to compete with them, right? You're trying to get into industries, you're trying to be like a worker with transferable skills and everything. You don't have them. But then on top of that, you're competing with people who already do, who already are controlling all those things, who, like, in any regular economic scenario, you are competing. Like, if you're a plumber, you're competing with the other plumbers in the area. Now pretend that you're a plumber, or you want to be a plumber, but not only have you not been given any of the tools your entire life to learn how to be a plumber, there's no access to you. Like, think about it, like trade schools. I don't even know if they exist at the time, but probably apprenticeships. Well, all the apprenticeships went to the white citizens. All the people who already knew the trades and everything, they're not going to teach the black people, because the black people in those states are like, they scorn them. They view them as non-human. They view them as not real citizens. So they're not going to teach you. Okay, well, go to a trade school. What trade schools? There are no black trade schools at this time period. All the trade schools in that time would have been owned by the white population there, who were discriminatory of the black population. So there's no black trade schools to teach the freed black former slaves. But then you need to go out there into the job market and the economy, where the only people with money to actually spend to hire people are the white citizens who don't view you as a human and who don't like you and want to discriminate against you. So good luck finding jobs. And then on top of that, again, you're competing with people who already have the skills and everything, who are keeping you from being able, from accessing that same opportunity. So, imagine you have all these people are now freed, but they don't really have economic opportunity. They don't really have like a true way to really kind of pick themselves up. And then in addition to this, the businesses at that time were segregated. So you're a black person, a freed black person now living in the South. Not only have you been kept in ignorance your entire life and kept from job opportunities your entire life, and none of the land is owned by you. It's all owned by people who used to be your slave owners. All the jobs, all the opportunities are owned by people who used to be your slave owners, or who have been treating you like less than human. But every time you go into a business, maybe you want to buy something, maybe you want to go get a service or buy some goods. Those businesses aren't going to serve you, because at that time period, it was legal for those businesses to literally discriminate. If you're, a former black slave in the South, businesses at that time did not have to do business with you. If you wanted to buy bread and fruit and groceries for your family, they're not going to sell to you. And there was no law against that. So they own everything. And not only do they own everything, but they're keeping you like out of any opportunity or access or economy during that time period. This is a part of the whole discrimination, racism aspect of American history that I feel like gets glossed over. There's a lot of people online today that want to pretend that systemic racism isn't an issue. But when you lay out the kind of scenario that I laid out for you, you can see how this is crazy and insane, and it's functionally hard, if like almost near impossible, for a group of people to reasonably be able to pick themselves up in that scenario. And keep in mind that the civil rights era comes about in the 1960s. And so between 1845, I think is the end of the Civil War. Maybe it's 65. At least, somewhere around 100 years, this group of people are segregated out of being able to have opportunity and economy and property in the South. They're ghettoized. I mean that, like, I'm not trying to like use it, oh, you're ghetto. I'm not trying to use that in derogatory word. I'm saying like the term ghettoize it doesn't just apply to the black population in the United States during that time period. That term, to ghettoize a population, you find it in like Nazi Germany, for example. The Nazis ghettoized the Jewish population. It's when you take like an ethnic group or any other kind of little, subgroup of a population, and you basically cut them off from resources, and you put them in areas, maybe you're not like physically, but like you make it so that the only place they really can go are the ghetto. And then they're now living in generations in the ghetto. And of course, this is going to have an effect on their outcomes and their opportunities. Yeah, of course. And so 100 years of that, then we get to the 1960s. Okay, keep in mind the 1960s. The 1960s in the United States, what is that? 60 years ago? 60 years ago. You have to understand, people who fought in the civil rights movement, people who were born and raised in segregation in this country, are still alive today. That was only 60 years ago. That means that if you look at boomers, all these people in charge of the United States government right now, on the Republican side, on the right, all these boomers, they were alive during this time period. They pretend like segregation and discrimination was thousands of years ago. They were alive for it, and they pretend like they don't know that. Black grandfathers and grandmothers alive today lived through segregation and had to fight for the right to have the vote, fight for the right to have jobs and opportunities, and to not be segregated against in their lifetime. Now, when it actually ends, when we finally do pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, does that mean everything changes overnight? Of course not, right? It's going to be a process, not only because there's going to be a lot of local governments that aren't going to immediately comply, be in full compliance of the new rules. They're going to try to skirt the rules. The federal government had to go in certain situations to make sure that the states were actually following the law. They didn't want to. They tried to protest it. They tried to violate it. But to change from a society that is by definition institutionally segregated to society that is actually colorblind and free and fair, that doesn't happen overnight. People today want to pretend that that happens overnight and that it wasn't that long ago. It was not that long ago. Boomers alive today lived through it, which means that the generation of black people that are growing up today are only the grandchildren of people who were discriminated against for most of their life, or I'm sorry, maybe not for most of their life, but for a significant portion of their life, and lived through it. Okay, how long do we expect it to take for a group that has been through that to suddenly reach parity with everybody else, to suddenly reach a level of economic self-sufficiency and, productivity and everything? We really expect it to happen overnight? We expect the population that was raised in segregation to just flip on a dime and all of a sudden everything's good. Now they're making as much as their white counterparts. Now they have as much opportunity. Now they have as much wealth. No, of course not. We think their children are going to do so. How are their children going to do so? They're raised by parents who themselves were raised in segregation, who didn't have the opportunity to build up the wealth or the skills or the networks. So their children probably aren't going to go be able to either. Ideally, the children do a little bit better, but we can't reasonably expect them to change all of that overnight. And then we get to the grandkids, which is basically where we're at right now, and then their great grandkids. But like, I mean, I think that they're doing a lot better than they have been in the past, but to expect for it to be like 100% even and perfect, and to pretend like racism is not a factor anymore, and that these populations aren't dealing with the systemic effects that trickle through the generations, it's fantasy. It's dismissiveness. It's callousness. It's irresponsibility. And so the Voting Rights Act, what it was intending to do was, in that same area in the South where they were heavily segregated during Jim Crow, those states would put into place things to try to keep black people from having the right to vote and from having representation. By the constitutional law, they should have had the right to vote, but they were putting things in place at the state level in order to try to make it in practice so that they can. So for example, they would put into place literacy tests. What's the issue with that? Well, and by the way, why would they put it into place at that point in time? Like, isn't it a bit of a coincidence that black people get, the right to vote, and then all of a sudden these states try putting in literacy tests? What's that all about? Well, it's because if you take a population who, again, was segregated, kept away from educational access, kept away from economic access, that population is going to be less likely to be literate as a function of the institutional segregation that they've experienced. And so it's a way for you to take away the right for the black population in your state to vote without calling it racially motivated. Oh, no. It's just a literacy test. We don't care if they're black or white. We're just trying to see if they can read or write. Okay, but you know very well that the population you're targeting is the black population, because you know very well that this is a population that hasn't been given the tools and opportunity to learn to read and write. Right. You're targeting them. And in addition to this, the districting of the states, let's just get to real fast because it's the topic of our conversation today. If you don't know, if you don't understand, if you're not from the United States, I need you to understand what districting is and what gerrymandering is. And this is going to tie back into what we were just talking about right now. I think this is the easiest infographic to understand. So you have a state, like let's pretend we had a state that was a perfect rectangle like this. I know that doesn't exist, but you get the idea. You have all these precincts. And if you look at these precincts, 60% of these precincts are blue. So the blue party, the Democratic Party. 40% of the red, the Republican Party, right? So 60% of the population that's in these precincts, Republican or Democrat, 40% in these precincts are Republican. So if things were proportional and representative, you would expect that the legislators that represent the districts there'd be roughly 60% Democrat, roughly 40% Republican. However, depending on how you draw the boundaries around the districts, you can manipulate this such that you wind up a scenario like this, for example, where 100% of the districts have a Democratic representative in the legislature. And so none of the red voters, none of the Republican voters in that state actually have representation in this scenario, because look at the way you've cut up these districts. In this district, there's 60% of the voters in there are blue, 40% are red. But the winner of that district only gets to send one representative to Congress. So that district all goes to blue. This district, same thing, all goes to blue, all goes to blue, all goes to blue. 100% blue, 0% red. The red voters in this state have no representation in the legislature. Now, in this scenario, this is a way to skew it so it's the opposite, where instead of the state's representation matching the voting population, where 60% are blue, 40% are red, it's flipped around. Three out of the 5. So 60% is red rather than 60% blue. 40% is blue rather than 40% red. And how do we do that? Well, let's look at this here. Look at this district. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 red. 1, 2, 3, 4. This district is red. It wins red. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versus 4. This district also wins red. And this one also wins red. And it leaves, look at just this one district here for the blue and this one district here for the blue that wins. So this is how gerrymandering works. It's a way of splitting up the population groups in your state into districts such that you can manipulate it so that it's not representing the actual interest groups of your state. And when I say interest groups, I mean the citizens themselves, but instead has a partisan lean towards one party or the other. Now, ideally, the way that the Constitution lays out districting, the Constitution says basically that the states are, have most of the authority to determine how they district. And so that's kind of an issue with our system, is that the Constitution didn't really, I don't know if they just didn't foresee this. I don't think they did. I don't recall any talk in the Constitutional Conventions about this problem. I don't think they realized that they were setting this up. I think this was actually like an omission on their part. But ideally, what the districts are supposed to do is they're supposed to be contiguous, meaning that there's an old graphic from back in the day when gerrymandering kind of first started, meaning that a district can't be like, okay, you have Rowley right here, right? Pretend you had Rowley and then you decided to make this part Methuian. You decided to combine these together into a district. Well, these aren't contiguous, right? They're not connected. There's a separation. Rowley's over here, Methusian is over there. But what's been happening now is that you'll have gerrymandered districts that snake through the state, like this one right here. And so ordinarily, if you had this district right here, okay, that's contiguous, and then maybe you have a population over here, right? But that wouldn't really be contiguous because this district is way over here, represents voters who maybe live in this area, who kind of share similar interests, maybe have similar ethnic origins and whatnot. And then you have one over here. But what we're doing now is we're taking this district and we're snaking it through the state to pick up this one over here to technically be contiguous, but you can see here that we're manipulating the map to do so. Ideally, what districts are supposed to do is there's supposed to be communities of people in the district, communities of citizens who have similar interest. That way, when they send a representative to Congress, that Congress is representing that subset of citizens in the state. And that way, ideally, it's not perfect, but ideally, all the different kind of like demographic, ethnic interest groups in your state have some representation in Congress. Now, the issue, of course, is that in the South, they were manipulating this because they did not want to have they didn't want their black citizens to have any representation or the right to vote. So they were, again, putting literacy tests in there to try to make it so that they don't have the right to vote because they can't pass a literacy test. Look at these gerrymandered districts. Look how bad these ones are. I know the image is kind of blurry, but look at how crazy these are. These are barely real, like actual contiguous districts. These are manipulating, putting little slivers of land to connect areas that are actually far apart from each other, different communities. So not only were they trying to take the right to vote away through things like literacy tests, but they're also trying to dilute any representation, like for those that actually did manage to vote, trying to dilute that away so that the white populations in the state outnumber any of the black people in any of the districts. So again, going back to this graph here, let's pretend that this was white voters versus black voters. Why should that matter? Well, it matters because in the Deep South, after the Civil War, during segregation, the white voting group in those states had a different interest than the black voting group. They voted differently for a very obvious reason, because the white population did not want the black population to have any representation or power. And so the black population in the state are going to vote differently, because if they vote for the same politicians that the white population in that state is voting, that those politicians are the politicians that are going to discriminate against the black population. So that black population group, in order for them to actually have like realistic representation in the state, they need to have representatives that actually represent their community's interests versus just the interest of the rest of the population of the state that is actively working to make sure that they are not represented. And so what happens is in the South, we can pretend like, let's say, 40% of this state is black citizens, 60% is white, and you wind up with the same situation here, which is, okay, the majority white population draws out their districts so that they can make sure that none of the black population in their state has any representation. Now, they can say on paper, like, oh, we're not being racist, we're not segregating, we're not trying to be discriminatory for black people. That's just how we drew our district. And they can come up with any like excuse for why they draw their district, right? As long as they're not like explicitly saying, hey, we're drawing the district this way to discriminate against black people. Oh, we're drawing this district this way for some other reason. But in effect, they're going to wind up doing the same thing, right? Which is the black population, which would be the red here, has zero representation in Congress as a result of the way that they've drawn their districts. And now with the recent Supreme Court ruling, the Louisiana versus Calais, again, the Voting Rights Act that was designed to make sure that black people are not having their right to vote stripped away from them through tricks like literacy tests, and to make sure that there are actually districts in their state that are actually representing their interests, the Supreme Court said, as long as the Republican states say that they're gerrymandering, because gerrymandering technically is not illegal. There's no actual law to outlaw gerrymandering. Democrats have tried to put a national ban on gerrymandering, and Republicans voted against it. Republicans won't tell you this. They'll pretend like, oh, gerrymandering is bad, everybody does it, we're just fighting fire with fire. Republicans have been given the opportunity to vote against and end gerrymandering, and they've decided against it. Every Republican in Congress voted against it in 2021 to ban it. And so what the Republican states are doing now with this Supreme Court ruling is the Supreme Court ruling is saying, okay, well, technically gerrymandering is not illegal. There's no law saying you can't do it. The Voting Rights Act says that you can't do it along racial lines. But what the Supreme Court did was they basically made it so that you can't really test that, because basically what the Supreme Court said was, if you are drawing districts to give a district to consider, which is what the Voting Rights Act did, to consider, hey, you have a black population that has their own unique, distinct interests and concerns. You need to make sure that you actually have a district that's representing this group. The Supreme Court said, oh, well, if you're considering race when you do that, that's racist. Does that sound racist to you? Or does that sound like you're abusing what the word and what the spirit of the word racism means in order to allow for discrimination against black people? So the Supreme Court said, if you're going to draw districts, like the Voting Rights Act said, to make sure that you have a district that represents black people, well, you're considering race, therefore it's racist and you can't do that. But if you draw your district, if you gerrymander your district based on partisan lines, because by the way, this is literally true. I'm not exaggerating. The Supreme Court said, if you want to draw your districts, gerrymander them because you want to explicitly give your party an advantage over the other political party, which I think by definition would be corruption. I don't know about you guys. I think that's definitionally corruption. The Supreme Court said, if you do that, there's no law against that. You're allowed to do that. And so now what these Republican states are doing is they're eliminating their black and metropolitan communities. They're eliminating representation for those communities by taking those communities, just like we saw in that little gerrymandering example, and they're splitting them up. Again, going back to the spirit of what a district is supposed to be. It's supposed to be one representative going to Congress that's supposed to represent a community group within the state. You have different communities in the state. You want to make sure that each one of them has representation. So you've taken a metropolitan area in your red state. Find an example. You've taken a metropolitan area in your red state, right? Ask yourself this question. People who live in dense urban metropolitan city areas versus people who live in rural communities, do they have the same concerns? Do they have the same day-to-day issues? Do they have the same culture? No, they don't, obviously. So if you are splitting up that city so that all of the voters who would ordinarily vote Democratic in those cities, their vote is diluted by all of these rural citizens on the outlying areas. And now those districts are majority Republican, going back again to the image we were looking at earlier, right? How you could take a population and split them up. So that way there's a majority from the other side. And the group in the city doesn't actually have representation in Congress. So I'm trying to find a good picture. There was a picture earlier that we looked at. So look at this, for example, right? This would be an example of a crazy gerrymander. What is going on here? This might actually be a Democratic gerrymander, but the point is, look at what's going on here. Look at these crazy districts. What the fuck is going on here? But you know why? It's because there's a major city right here. And so what's happening is you are manipulating populations. I think in this case, they're probably taking the population from the city and diluting the population in the rural areas in order to make all of these districts blue. And then all of the rural voters in here who would ordinarily vote Republican, they're not represented. So you could go either way with that, right? But you could flip it around the other way. You could take a city like this, depending on how you draw your districts, majority Democratic voters living in cities, living in the city here. And then you spread out the district, you split it up so that the rural voters outnumber any of the blue voters in any of these small little districts. And then this shifts the other way where it's all Republican. So depending on how you do it, you can kind of flip things either way there. But that's what the Republican states are doing now, is all of them. And by the way, all of these Republican states that are doing it, they're all states that were in the Confederacy. They're all states that used to practice segregation and Jim Crow. They're all the states that were, prior to the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act, they were all the states that were explicitly discriminating against their black populations, trying to keep them from voting, trying to strip them of any representation. And now they've all moved towards, I know that there's a picture showing all of these. Republican Gerrymander 2025 Voting Rights Act 2026, my bad. I know there's pictures that are showing like the before and after of like what those districts look like before the Supreme Court knocked it out, and now what they look like with the new gerrymandered districts that the Republicans are trying to pass. Before, after. Okay, here's a good one right here. Okay. I just want to see the picture. Okay. So here are the states. So we have Louisiana, we have Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Again, just to drive the point home here, these are the Confederate States. This is the Confederacy. This is a country that existed for like for like 1 or 2 years or whatever it was. Existed only. This is not America. Okay, understand this. When you see these Confederate flags, this is not an American flag. This is not American tradition. This is not. The Confederacy only ever existed to separate itself from the United States and then went to war against the United States. The Confederacy never existed at peace with the United States. They only ever existed as a separatist movement that tried to steal territory away from the United States and then instigated a war with the United States. And they did so explicitly in their documentation. They admitted they did so specifically to maintain slavery. This country, this Confederacy country, only ever existed to be a slave state at war with the United States, and you still see people in the South, in the United States, flying this flag around. This is literally traitorous, treasonous behavior. But they feel incredibly comfortable in our country to do this all the time. It's insane. If you don't understand American history, if you're from another country and you're watching this, I'm being serious. You drive around rural parts of America and you see people waving this around. This country only existed at war with the United States. This is not our history. This would be like flying a terrorist organization's flag around your country, a terrorist organization that went to war with your country around. This is not an exaggeration. This is political violence to achieve a political end from a thing that was stealing territory from the United States that only ever existed at war with the United States. And they fly this flag around like it's nothing. It's crazy. And so again, keep in mind, look at these states: Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Florida. Look at these states. Look at the states that are now going to gerrymander away all of the districts that are majority black or urban districts in order to turn the entire thing into a Republican district. Okay? I mean, Virginia is the outlier here, but all of the rest is pretty much the same map. I mean, Arkansas isn't going in that direction. I don't know why they're not showing Texas, because Texas is leaning in that direction too. Like, Texas has already done a lot of gerrymandering, right? But you get the point. Look at this. So right here, this is probably a urban city area. If we actually pull up a map of Georgia. Georgia. You could tell where the major cities are, because the major cities are usually where the blue is. It's usually where people vote Democratic. There's Georgia, the state, and then there's Georgia, the state. No, I'm just kidding. There's Georgia, the country, which in a geopolitical context is known as a state. And there's Georgia, the state of the United States. So you see here, Atlanta. That's where Atlanta is. Atlanta's going to have a sizable black population. That's why it's Democratic there. Let's look at South Carolina. So South Carolina, where's the major city in South Carolina? Do you know why black people don't live in the boonies in these states, in the rural areas? It's because there's safety in numbers. When you're out in the rural areas, the rural parts of the United States, rural Dixie, if your white neighbors want to discriminate against you, who's going to know? It's like a tree falling in the woods. who's going to be around to tell the story? Out here in the middle of fucking nowhere, when are the police going to show up? And the police themselves are also born and raised in these, you know, all white, rural, conservative, frankly speaking, racist communities. Are the police really going to make an effort and treat you well? Probably not. Let's look at South Carolina, though. Okay, major city, we have Columbia. So Columbia's right here in this area here. Columbia's already kind of gerrymandered, is it not? Or I'm sorry, Columbia is the capital city. Let's look at South Carolina population density. Here's a population density map. So we can see the major cities here, 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 right? And so prior to, in 2024, prior to the recent Supreme Court ruling, so you have this big population center here, and it's already kind of gerrymandered, but at least they left one for the Democratic voting population in the state. With this map, there's none. It's gone. Here's an interesting question. What is the voter breakdown of South Carolina? Give us a better idea. Okay, hold on. 2024. Party affiliation. Oh, that's for the primary, for the Republican primary. I want to know, like, how many Democrats versus Republicans in the state. Here we go. Okay. So 58% voted for Donald Trump, 40% voted for Kamala Harris. So this state is not quite 50-50, but based on this gerrymander map, you would think the overwhelming vast majority of the state is voting Republican with very few Democrats. But the actual number is close to that 60-40. There is no 60-40 on this map. This map is utterly annihilated with gerrymandering. Even this old one from 2024 was already gerrymandered pretty much, right? Look at this. There's only one district out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1 out of 8. What is 1 out of 8? 1 out of 4 is 25%. 1 out of 8 would be 12.5%. 12.5% versus 40%. Okay? So you get the point, right? All of these states are working to eliminate their black voting population's representation in Congress. And you'll hear a lot of Republicans try to make this argument, oh, it's one person, one vote. What does it matter, right? Everybody gets to vote. The black people still get to vote. Yeah, they do get to vote, but their vote's meaningless. You've rendered their vote meaningless because you've split up those populations such that even though they vote Democratic and they want a Democratic representative to represent their interests, you've made it so that there are none. They get none. Their vote is basically symbolic. They don't get anything. They don't get any representation in Congress. And this will affect the state legislature, and it'll affect the federal legislature. A lot of people you're going to see in this debate here, Brad, for example, he's under the delusion that, okay, if you gerrymander a state like South Carolina, that's just an issue in South Carolina. It doesn't affect the other states. Well, no, because the ability to gerrymander not only affects the districts for the state legislatures, but it also affects the gerrymander. Like, they can also gerrymander the districts for the federal U.S. House of Representatives. Okay? So you are depriving citizens in your state, population groups who have a different concern, different interests, different experiences. You're depriving them of any representation at the state level and at the federal level. Okay. And then that affects at the federal level, that affects every other state, because decisions made at the federal level affect the entire country now. And so this idea that, oh, if you gerrymander a state like Louisiana, it only affects Louisiana. No, it affects the entire country now. Understand, in the United States, we're living under a scenario where gerrymandering is make it such that we're going to wind up living under a one-party dictatorship. it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point is that it's making it such that our system is so skewed in the favor of Republicans that we are depriving the Democrats in this country of representation, like fair representation in our country. And people will talk around this. They'll talk over this. They'll ignore the reality of what that means is that you have, right? This is not a country with 90% Republicans. Roughly half of the people who vote for Republicans, roughly half vote for Democrats. You are taking half of the country and saying, we don't give a fuck about your representation. We don't care about what's fair for you. You can suck a nut. Like, we pretend. It's so crazy to me that we don't really talk about it in this way in our media. This idea that it's okay to just take half of our country and decide we don't care that you guys don't have representation. We don't care that all of our institutions are skewed so that they don't represent you well. It doesn't matter, right? This isn't a country of 10%. It's not 90% Republican. It's 50-50. And yet they're okay with skewing things so that the Supreme Court is Republican, so that the Congress is Republican, so that the presidency is Republican, so that the Senate and the House is Republican, so that the state legislatures are all Republican, so that those states' Supreme Courts, as a result of the legislatures being Republican, are also Republican. So they're just consolidating everything for the Republicans in this country, and half of the country not represented by the media either, because the media doesn't speak to this concern, this passion, this injustice on the rest of the country. The media doesn't even talk about it. The media feels like, oh, liberals and Democrats in the country, the fact that we're being cheated in our own country, that we're being deprived representation, they're treating us like they don't represent the media. The national media in the United States should represent all of the citizens of the United States. They ignore us. They treat us like the injustices to our populations do not matter. And it's unacceptable. So that's the context of this entire conversation, this debate here. The other aspect too that we're going to talk about is what's going on in Virginia itself. Not West Virginia, but Virginia. Because Abigail Spanberger, the Democrats had managed to win a majority in that state. It had been Republican for a long time. They won a majority in the state. And now they're starting to try to do things to rebalance things back out so that Democrats are actually represented in the state. Because let's look at the state. Virginia voting 2024. Oh, it was right here. Again, this is almost 50-50. There's almost 50% Republicans, 50% Democrats in this state. But if we looked at, Virginia voting districts 2020. Look at this. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Virginia's congressional districts 1, 2, 3, 4. Is this before or after the jury? Okay, hold on. Okay, look at this. Six Dem, 5 GOP. Okay, and then they wanted to move towards 10 Dem, 1 GOP. Okay, anyways. So the Democrats in Virginia, when they took over, they wanted to gerrymander the state. Why? Well, Abigail Spanberger initially ran on not doing that. But once Donald Trump was pushing for Texas to gerrymander and the rest of these Republican states to gerrymander, then you saw like Gavin Newsom lead the charge and these other Democratic governors say, hey, you know what? Like, we don't want to gerrymander. In fact, our voters, Democratic voters, were built differently. When we are given the ability to vote, we decide to vote for nonpartisan, fair districting commissions, where in California, for example, it was 50% of the districting commission has to be Republican, 50% has to be Democrat, and then you have a few independents in the middle as well. So that way, no one group is drawing up the districts to favor their own group. That's what Democrats do in multiple states that they've taken control of. But the Republicans have gerrymandered every state they take control of. So prior to this recent round of gerrymandering wars that we're experiencing now, the Democrats were moving in the direction of nonpartisan districting commissions and trying to get a ban at the national level. Abigail Spanberger ran on that platform, but when Donald Trump and the Republicans moved even further, try to push even more gerrymandering, at a certain point, the Democrats look at that scenario and go, okay, if we just let you guys continue doing that without any response, and if the Supreme Court keeps whittling away voting protections and, allowing Republicans to gerrymander unfairly, we don't have an option. It's self-preservation. It's like, we have to do something, or Republicans are going to, like, it's an existential issue. We have to have some representation. We can't just live under a dictatorship where 50% of the country is dictating for the rest of the 50% of the country, right? So we have to do something. We don't want to gerrymander. Throughout the 2010s, you could see very clearly that Democratic voters and Democratic politicians were moving towards ending gerrymandering. We didn't want to do it. We passed it when we had the opportunities. We passed bans on gerrymandering in the states that we had them. But we can't just do that unilaterally while the Republicans gerrymander everything in order to take control of our entire institutions. We have to do something. So Abigail Spanberger then moves towards gerrymandering, a Democratic gerrymander, to counterbalance the Republican gerrymandering. Understand that there's a difference between offense and self-defense. Offense, you're engaging in violence to, assault a person, to offend a person. Self-defense, we don't treat even though self-defense is violent, if you shoot someone in self-defense, that is a violent act, right? But it's not violence in a vacuum. It's violence as self-defense. Gerrymandering in a vacuum is bad. As a principle, it's bad. But when you live in a society where 50% of the country is gerrymandering every area that they can get their hands on, and in doing so, they're going to strip you of representation in your own government. If you're gerrymandering back as a act of self-defense, we have to be adults and acknowledge that that's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. So again, look at the state. This is a 50-50 state. And yet look at these districts. So anyway, so Virginia, under Abigail Spanberger, the new governor, new Democratic voter, she moves to do a Democratic gerrymander because, we see all these Republicans doing gerrymandering. So, we're trying to counter that. It's not that we want to do this. We have to do it to save our country and save ourselves from living under a right-wing dictatorship. By definition, if you have a system where one party has unfairly taken control of every institution of your government and deprived the other 50% of your country of representation and rights, you live under a dictatorship. I know people they get triggered over words. That's what that means. Okay, I'm sorry, but that's what it is. You don't want to be called a dictatorship? Stop acting like one, right? So anyways, she moves towards it. Again, gerrymandering is not illegal or unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has ruled that over and over again. If the Republicans are going to be allowed to gerrymander, then we need to do the same thing. So they do that and they're successful. And the Supreme Court of Virginia decides to overturn it. Now, prior to me looking this up, my understanding, I looked at it and I read about it, and it seemed like, what? I hate that it's the case, but it sounds like that Supreme Court ruling, the Supreme Court of Virginia, not the Supreme Court of the United States, the Supreme Court at the state level. I looked at that ruling and thought, well, it sucks, but I think they're right, because what they said was early voting had already started by the voters before the gerrymander by Virginia went into effect, before it was ratified. Ratified would be the right word, right? Ratified. So that sounds like an issue, right? Oh, well, wait a second. You didn't give all of the voters an opportunity to vote on that gerrymandering question. That's what the headlines would lead you to believe, but that's not actually the case. It turns out that in Virginia, there's a 3-step process to passing a constitutional amendment. The first process is that the current sitting assembly of the Congress, when I say assembly of the Congress, right? You have at the state level, you have a Congress, even at the federal level, you have a Congress, right? You have a Congress, right? But think about it. You vote for congressmen every couple of years. So every time that you have an election for congressmen, the composition of that Congress might change because some people will get voted out, new people will get voted in. The composition of that Congress will change. Whenever you have a new Congress, because new people were voted in or voted out, you can think of it as a new assembly of the Congress. You have the current assembly of the Congress. You have a future assembly of the Congress that would be the future version of the Congress once new people are voted in and voted out. So in the Virginia process for amending the Constitution, the first process is the current assembly of the Congress has to bring the proposition up and then bring it to a General Assembly. General Assembly means both the Senate and the House. In the United States, our legislatures are broken up into two houses. One is a Senate where you basically get like one senator per district. Well, it's not exactly right. At the federal level, you have one senator per state. The House is more population based. It's instead of one per area or whatever, you get a certain number depending on the population of those areas. Okay, you get what I'm saying? So the first step in the process, the current assembly of Congress has to bring up the proposition to a General Assembly, meaning both the House and the Senate chambers of the legislature both have to be there. Okay? They vote on it, it gets passed. Now it's in limbo. It's waiting for step 2. Step 2 is the next assembly of Congress, not the current one, the next assembly of Congress, meaning voters now have the opportunity to vote out legislators, vote in new ones. The next one that meets after that election process, that new assembly of Congress, that new one also has to vote for the proposed amendment. That's step 2. Step 3 is that then once you've passed both of those steps, then you put the proposed amendment up to the voters, and the voters of the state will vote on it by popular election. Whoever wins that vote, if it passes and the voters approve of it, then that amendment to the Constitution is ratified. The Virginia legislature, or whatever, they went through that process. They went through step 1, they went through step 2, they went through step 3, and they got it passed through every single step. What the Virginia Supreme Court actually argued was not that on that step 3 where the voters vote for it, the Virginia Supreme Court wasn't talking about step 3. They were talking about step 1. They were saying at step 1, there was early voting that was going on. And during step 1, when the state legislators were voting on the amendment, early voting from the voters was already going on. So some voters who were voting in the early, voting, whatever. The Virginia Supreme Court said they weren't able to express, the voters who had already voted weren't able to express their opinion on the amendment. Well, wait a second. Step 1 and step 2 aren't the voters that are deciding step 1 and step 2. Step 1 and step 2 are the legislators, meaning the officials who are in Congress, the congressmen. Step 1 and step 2 is about the congressmen. And this is why, after I actually read into the case, I realized the Virginia Supreme Court wasn't being reasonable. They weren't actually talking about the actual process. They made shit up. We'll read it right now. Virginia amendment process. I want you to know that I'm talking about the actual text of the amendment process. Okay? This is from the Constitution of Virginia. Any amendment or amendments, I think this is stupid. You should just put any amendments. I think everybody knows what you mean. Any amendments to this Constitution may be proposed in the Senate or in the House of Delegates, meaning one person from either the Senate or the House, or maybe it's not one person, but the Senate or the House, there's two chambers. You only need one of them to bring it up. However, you then need to bring it to a General Assembly. So only one of the houses have to bring up the proposition, but it needs to then be put to a vote. So, okay, maybe proposed in the Senate or the House, and if the same, so if the Senate or the House shall agree by a majority of the members, okay, realize we're not talking about the voters, the citizen voters in the state. All of this, we're talking about the delegates, the representatives, the officials in Congress, by a majority of the members of Congress, by a majority of the members elected to each of the two houses. Such proposed amendment or amendments shall be entered on their journals. Okay, so in other words, the House or the Senate can bring it up, but then it has to be voted on by both of the houses. Okay, so both the Senate and the House have to vote on it. If it passes both, then it's cleared the first step. But also, their vote, however they voted, needs to be publicly logged, right? It needs to enter it in on their journals. So it can't be like a secret vote. People need to know how the members voted. Okay, that's step one. They accomplished that. Step two, the name of each member and how he voted to be recorded and referred to the General Assembly of... Okay, so again, it needs to be publicly recorded. And then it gets referred to the General Assembly. General Assembly means both chambers, the House and the Senate, both meeting at the same time. Referred to the General Assembly at its first regular session held after the next general election of the member of the House of Delegates. So this is a little bit confusing, but this is what I was saying, which is that you have the current assembly, they've already passed it. Now they're waiting for the next assembly after the voters vote in and vote out members of that of the Congress. So it needs to be referred to the next General Assembly, first regular session. It can't be a special session after the general election of the House of Delegates. So it needs to then it needs to be passed by the next assembly of the Congress. So you're having like two iterations of the Congress are both approving of it. That's step two. If at such regular session or any subsequent special session of that General Assembly, the proposed amendment or amendments shall be agreed to by a majority of the members elected to the House. Okay, so again, that second assembly of legislators also have to agree on it. Clear step two. Then it shall be the duty of the General Assembly to submit the proposed amendment or amendments to the voters. That's step three. Step three, now we're talking about the voters. Okay, understand, everything up to this point is the decision of the members of the legislature, nothing about the voters of the legislature, or the voters of the state. It's the legislators themselves, the officials. Only at step three do we now put it in front of the voters. And then they vote for it in such a manner as shall be prescribed, and not sooner than 90 days after final passage of the General Assembly. So in other words, after it's already cleared step two, and the second assembly of Congress has voted for it, you have to give at least 90 days, and then the voters can vote on it. Every one of these steps were followed. If the majority of those voting in favor of any amendment, it shall become part of the Constitution on the date prescribed by the general. Okay, so then it becomes part of the Constitution. So they passed all of these steps. What the Supreme Court of Virginia was saying was that not at step three down here. They're saying at step one right here, where it's, we'll read it again. They're saying at step one, the voters didn't get to have a say. Okay, keep in mind, the voters versus the members of Congress. The voters means the citizens of the state. They're not elected representatives. They're not officials holding office. They're not members of the legislature. The voters versus the congressmen. The congressmen are elected representatives who sit in the Congress, who are congressmen. These are two different groups. Okay, let's read it again. Let's just make sure we all understand. Any amendment or this is step one. Any amendment or amendments to the Constitution may be proposed in the Senate or the House of Delegates. Senate or House of Delegates. Nothing about the voters of the states, the Senate or the House of Delegates. And if the same, meaning the House or the Senate, if the same shall be agreed to, or I'm sorry, the same is the amendment in this case, agreed to by the majority of the members elected members, not voters, elected members to each of the two houses of Congress, not regular voters, people who are members of the houses of Congress. Such proposed amendments shall be entered on their journals. Their journals, meaning not the journals of voters, the journals of the members of the Congress. The name of each member and how he voted to be recorded and referred to the General Assembly. The General Assembly is, maybe I'm wrong about this. Let's double check. The General Assembly is just both houses of Congress. a formal overarching legislative body. Okay, so again, this is not the voters. This is the General Assembly of legislators at its first regular session held after. Okay, now we're getting to step 2. So the Virginia Supreme Court said that it was at step 1 here that the voters didn't get to express their opinion. They were talking about, oh, this process, this part, step 1 here, was occurring while early voting had already started. Well, let me ask you this question. What part of this right here says anything about the voting public? Nothing. This step 1 is not about the will of the voters. This step 1 is about the will of the members of Congress. The will of the voters, it's important, which is why the will of the voters is the final check on step 3 down here. So when the Supreme Court of Virginia overturned this effort to gerrymander, which is legal, it's legal. When the Supreme Court of Virginia overturned it, they overturned it saying that step 1 didn't allow the early voters to express their opinion. The role of the courts is not to make up the law. It's not to decide what the law is. The role of the courts in the United States, their only role is to look at the law as already been passed and the Constitution, not to make it up, not to decide what they want it to be, to simply look at what it actually is and then decide whether something is following it or not. The Supreme Court of Virginia may not like that at step 1 they're not asking for the voters' opinion, but that's not up to the court to decide. All the court has to decide, the only thing that they have the authority to do is look at this and say whether or not that process was followed, whether it's in accordance with this part of the Constitution. So when the Supreme Court of Virginia says the voters didn't get to have a say, the Supreme Court of Virginia that's a corrupt action. That is the Supreme Court of Virginia making up stuff that's not actually in the law. That's them not actually following the letter of the law in the Constitution of Virginia. Once I read that, once I realized that that ruling by the Supreme Court of Virginia was not only a bad ruling, it is a corrupt ruling. It's an insane, crazy ruling. It is a partisan ruling. Keep in mind that the composition of the Supreme Court of Virginia is like, I think it's like 3-1 Republican. Virginia Supreme Court composition. 7 justices, okay? Composition by ideology. They won't say party because oftentimes they don't technically have a party. Yes, we know it's formally not party. I want to know, in effect, what is it? 7-member court as small C conservative. Okay. By what margin? Justice Chloe Powell. Goddamn. Fucking AI. But you get the point. I know this to be the case. The majority of the Supreme Court of Virginia is conservative. It's Republican leaning, and they were put in place by Republicans when Republicans had control of the state. So think about, like, this ruling doesn't make sense. It doesn't actually follow the Constitution. They're making stuff up. Why are they making stuff up? Well, could it be that they have a conservative Republican bias and they're trying to get a conclusion that they want, which is that they don't want the Democrats to gerrymander the state, even though the Democrats have the legal authority to do so, because they know that hurts Republicans in the state? Well, I'm sorry, but your role as a justice is not to make shit up based on how you feel about it. You don't get to decide that. All you get to decide is whether or not they're following the law or not. And they followed the law. Okay. So that's the context of this entire debate, this entire conversation. That's the rundown of what's going on with the whole gerrymandering thing and the gerrymandering in Virginia. If you've heard the headlines, if you heard stories, if you don't know what's all going on. By the way, this whole part that I described to you about what's going on in Virginia, I haven't heard any political commentators talk about this. I haven't heard the media talk about this. Every time the media reports on it, they say, "Oh, early voting had already started, so the ruling said that that voters didn't get to decide." Well, motherfucker, you are the media, you are journalists. You're supposed to tell the population when you report that information that, hey, even though early voting had already started, that's irrelevant because the Constitution of the state says nothing in step 1 about what the voters' interests are. Okay, so let me read. There's an article I looked up the other day, the last time I did the stream yesterday. Virginia voting day, early voting gerrymandering, which I thought did a good job kind of explaining this, or a decent job. Okay, CNN article. We'll skim through this real fast. Virginia Supreme Court dealt a blow to Democrats last week with the tit for tat redistricting war playing out ahead of midterms. In a 4-3 ruling, justices nullified a new condition. So, but also keep in mind this, right, is that the Supreme Court at the federal level gutted the Voting Rights Act, which is now allowing all these Republican states in the South to gerrymander and strip representation away from Democratic and black voters in their states. So Republicans are able to gerrymander the fuck out of our country. And then when Democrats try to do it in their state as a counterbalance, even though they followed the process, Republican justices, Republican members of the court are just making shit up to keep them from being able to do so. So our court system in the United States is allowing Republicans to cheat legally, but they're not allowing Democrats to respond in kind, even when the Democrats are following what the letter of the law and the Constitution is. And there's something that you need to understand is that the courts of our country, especially in the Supreme Court level, they're confirmed by the legislatures. So if the legislatures are gerrymandered so that they are Republican biased, those legislatures then get to confirm the justices. Now the Supreme Courts in the courts around the country are skewed in favor of Republicans, so that those Republican skewed courts can issue rulings like the one we just looked at that are corrupt, but they're corrupt in favor of the Republican Party in order to maintain control of the state legislatures for the Republican Party, so that those state legislatures can also maintain control of the Supreme Courts around the country. Understand that that's now a feedback loop where the voters of the country, even if it's 50-50, the voters have no ability to reform the system to make it representative of themselves. Now the Republicans have taken full control of the system and insulated their power from any ability to reform it. How are you going to reform that? Ask yourself that question. How do you reform that system? There's no way. How do you make that system representative anymore? There's no way. The legislatures get to draw up the districts. The districts give them a majority. The majority is able to confirm the judges. The judges can sit there and make it so that any attempt to reform that system, even if it does passes, they just vote it down, or they rule it down. So there's no way to balance that system back out. It's a one-way ratcheting effect, a one-way extremism, like march towards extremism and one-party control, where there's no way to reform that system. Okay, moving on. In a 4-3 ruling, justices nullified a new congressional map that could have given the Democrats 4 additional seats in the House of Representatives. Their argument centered on whether state lawmakers had followed proper procedure. Okay, hold on a second. Gerrymandering 2026 Voting Rights Act. So Democrats in Virginia were only trying to pick up 4 extra seats. Now look at what the ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States has given Republicans. God damn it. Do this again. 2026 Gerrymander Republican Voting Rights Act. So Virginia was only like all they were trying to do is pick up 4 additional seats. Look at what the Supreme Court of the United States has given Republicans the ability to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 12, 12, 13. I think I missed this one. 13. So Democrats weren't even to just pick up fucking 4. And now the Republicans have been given the ability to pick up 13. Right? Okay. Could have given 4 additional seats in the House of Representatives. Their argument centered on whether state lawmakers had followed proper procedure when they put a constitutional amendment on the ballot to allow for redistricting. The procedural question hinged on linguistic technicality. What constitutes an election? But like this, and the media has to be more careful about this. Like, this begs the question, why are we even talking about election in the first place? Because we're treating this like this is a legitimate question by even putting this up here at the front. But again, at step 1, the election doesn't matter. Step 1 has nothing to do with an election. But now we're arguing about what the definition of election is. So by doing that, by allowing the focus to shift to what is the definition of election, we've bypassed the question of why are you guys even considering election in the first place? Step 1 has nothing to do with the election. Traditionally, and in Virginia's case, under the requirements of the state constitution, states have redrawn their congressional districts every 10 years when a new census comes out, and 435 members of the House are reapportioned according to the state's new shares of the population. But President Donald Trump, facing dismal polling and risking losing his party's... See, and that's the other thing, is that Republicans are unpopular. They're slated to lose the midterms. When they're about to lose because the voters of the country decide, hey, you guys are going too far, your shit's crazy, they just start cheating. And so now the voter, like, even when Republicans are doing bad policy and doing things that the voters of this country disapprove of, the Republicans, instead of being able to even be voted out, they just start rigging things so that they can't even be voted out. Has urged Republican-controlled states to launch an aggressive mid-decade rounding of redistricting in the hopes of gerrymandering Democratic seats off the map. Democratic-controlled states like California and Virginia have set out to draw gerrymanders of their own, aiming to wipe out Republican seats. Virginia voters in a referendum last month agreed to amend the state constitution to temporarily adopt new congressional districts to restore fairness in the upcoming elections, then to revert to the old rules after 2030. By the way, this goes to show the motivation behind Democrats is that, they don't even want to do this. This is a temporary thing. They're even setting it up so that it expires in 2030 because the whole point is that this isn't really something that we like to do on principle. It's something that we're temporarily engaging in because if we don't, the Republicans are going to rig the entire system against us. It's existential. That vote was meant to be a final part of the multi-step process for amending the Virginia Constitution. Before an amendment can go to public referendum, it needs to be approved by the state legislature on 2 separate occasions. See, if you read this article up to this point, you would have thought like, oh, the voters had a chance to vote on it, but this whole part about like what is an election day, what does early voting count? Oh, it has to do with that final step. Only once we get to the mid part of this article, then it talks about, oh, actually, what we're actually talking about is it needs to be approved by the state legislatures on 2 separate occasions. So if you're somebody who's only reading headlines and maybe only reading the first few paragraphs, you might be led to believe that we're talking about that final step, but we're not. Once before the next general election, and again after that election, under the newly chosen legislature. Once before the next general election. I don't think this is true. Let's reread the wording there. Virginia. Process. Any amendment or amendments to this Constitution may be proposed in the State House delegates, and if the same shall be agreed on by a majority of the members elected to each of the 2 houses, such proposed amendment or amendments shall be entered on the public journals, the name of each member and how he voted to be recorded, and referred to the General Assembly at its first regular session held after. Yeah, there's nothing in this step says that this has to happen before the next general election. In this article, I don't know, I can understand why they might have a misunderstanding here, but that's not actually what the text of the amendment process actually says. It doesn't say that first step has to be before the next general election. It doesn't say that. And again, after that election, under the newly chosen legislature, this part is true. This part right here is like a misunderstanding of technically what it's saying. This part is true. It does have to be reaffirmed by the next legislature. But this part about the first legislature approving it has nothing to do with it being approved before the next general election. The previous Virginia legislature passed the amendment on October 31st. Election day followed on November 4th. The newly elected legislature then repassed the amendment on January 16th, 2026, to send it to voters on April 21st. Before Virginia Supreme Court justices, 3 of them confirmed under Republican controlled legislatures, ruled that the April voting was invalid. Although 2 successive legislatures had approved the amendment, the court argued that the first vote back in October, so the first step, had come too late rather than voting before the election. But again, there's nothing in there that says they have to vote before the election. As the constitutional timetable required, what are they talking about? That's not there. It doesn't say that, right? Am I misreading? Do I not understand things? I don't see anything here in the first step. Let's just make sure we're highlighting the entire first step. After the next general election of the House, if such regular session or any subsequent special session of that the proposed amendment or amendment shall be agreed to by a majority of all the members, then it shall be the duty to okay, no, it's up to voted to be recorded and referred to the next first regular session as first held after the next general. Okay, so this is step 1. Just, we're going to read this again. I know this is tedious, but I want to make sure that we're being technically correct here. They're talking about, rather than voting before the election as the Constitution timetable requires. Let's see, does this say anything about a timetable where they have to vote? In step 1, they have to vote before the election? Any amendment or amendments to this Constitution may be proposed in the state or the Senate or the House of Delegates, and if the same shall be agreed by a majority of the members elected to each of the 2 houses, such proposed amendment or amendments shall be entered on their journals, the name of each member and how he voted to be recorded and referred to the General Assembly at its first regular session, held after the next general election. Okay, actually, this is step 1. This is the part that has to do with when they're supposed to vote on it. This part right here, and referred to the next to the General Assembly. This part is after they voted, after the members of the Congress have voted. This is the timetable of when the step 1 legislators are supposed to vote. Nothing in this says that it has anything to do with when early voting starts for the voters, like for the average citizen, for the citizens that are voting. This has to do with the voting of the legislature. When they talk about early voting, they're talking about early voting for the voters, for the citizen voters. They're not talking about, there's no early voting for the legislature. Nothing in this has any, this constitutional timetable. This isn't a thing. I don't know if the author of this misunderstood or whatever it may be. The legislature had voted after the 2025 general election already happened. In doing so, the court defined the election as having, but this doesn't even matter. This is what you call red herring. This is a distraction. This whole argument over what is defined as an election, like as a general election, this has nothing to do with that step 1 process as having come into existence when early voting commenced on September 19th. Okay, but keep this in mind, like this argument, this is irrelevant, but even if we granted that needed to happen, it gets worse. Okay? And not merely taking place on election day. By the time Virginia's General Assembly approved the amendment on October 31st, the court argued more than 1.3 million Virginians had already cast their ballots and therefore could not use their votes to express their approval or disapproval of the proposal. It doesn't matter. This part right here, the voters voting to express their approval or disapproval, only happens at step 3. Then it shall be the duty of the general to submit such proposed amendments or amendments to the voters qualified. This is step 3. This has nothing to do with step 1. The definition in this step 3 process already happened. The Supreme Court of Virginia is not arguing that at step 3, when the voters are supposed to vote on it, that the early voters didn't get the opportunity to. They're saying that the early voters didn't get to express their opinion during step 1, but step 1 has nothing to do with the voters of the state. Step 1 has to do with the legislators. I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but I want to make this excruciatingly clear and excruciatingly technical that what's going on here. Cannot use their votes to express approval or disapproval of the proposal. The definition of election has always broadly denoted the act of choosing. Just so the justices who use this definition to overrule the gerrymander, they're relying on definitions that are coming out of dictionaries. They're not relying on the definition that comes from the law of Virginia. Because as we get down the article here, there are going to be people that talk about this, right? Citing early dictionaries from lexigraphs of Samuel Johnson and Noah Webster, as well as legal dictionaries such as Black's Law Dictionary, Kelsey denoted several pages of the opinion to parsing the meaning of an election. He argued that average citizens who cast their ballots early would likely understand themselves to be voting in the election. This lexical sense of the noun election must be distinguished from the noun phrase election day, he wrote. But again, this doesn't matter because step one has nothing to do with that. He continued, the metes and bounds of the election begin with the point of casting votes and end with the point of receiving votes and closing the polls on the last day of the election. Election day is the boundary marker for the last act constituting an election. Now, let me take a swig real fast because my voice is getting dry. Hold on. If we were talking about step 3, these would be reasonable questions to ask. What counts as an election for the voters who are voting on this? This would be a legitimate question to be asking. And if you were to ask this question, what is the actual definition of when an election starts, when that date starts, what the cutoff is? Where would you look for that? It sounds reasonable that you would look at dictionary definitions, right? But why wouldn't you look at the definition that's given to you by the actual law of Virginia? Notice these justices here, they're not talking about looking up the definition in Virginia law. They're talking about looking at dictionaries that aren't part of the legal system. Talking about looking at dictionaries from a different time period. Citing, okay. He continued, okay. The minority took issue with this definition. An election, the justices on the losing side countered, is the event that happens on election day. By focusing on the legislative history, dictionary definitions, how legal scholars might interpret the term election, Chief Justice Chloe Powell wrote in dissent, the majority fails to apply the most basic tenet of interpretation of constitutional provisions, looking to the language of the Constitution itself. Why are we pulling definitions from other dictionaries rather than the definitions that are given to us in the Constitution and the law of Virginia? Powell argued that the majority's definition of election contradicts how the word is defined in the state and federal law. So look, if there was no definition given in the state law, I can understand going to dictionaries at the time that the amendment was passed when they changed this. I can understand that. But we don't have to do that. We have what an election is defined as in the actual law. She cited a provision of Virginia's Constitution that states that the members of the House of Delegates shall be elected on the Tuesday succeeding the first Monday in November. So the Constitution of Virginia already tells you what is defined as the time frame of an election. It's already defined. You don't need to go to other dictionaries. If your job is as a justice, you should be following the law. She also cited Virginia Code, so this would be, I understand, statutory law versus constitutional law, which indicates that the general election is an election held in the Commonwealth on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So this definition of what counts as when the election starts in Virginia law is both affirmed in their Constitution and in their statutory code. And yet, the justices who struck down the gerrymander ignored both of these definitions to pull dictionaries out of definitions out of layman dictionaries that are not the legal standard. To make this point, the dissent ventured into metaphysical considerations about the mechanisms of time. Treating the early voting period as part of the election would create a causality paradox. The dissent, I don't even think these arguments are really necessary. An election is a process that begins with early voting, but early voting must precede an election by 45 days. Powell wrote, the majority's definition creates an infinite voting loop that appears to have no established beginning, only a definitive end, election day. The dissent argued that the majority's definition of election poses other conundrums as well. For example, Virginia law stipulates voters can't be compelled to attend trials during the time of an election. Here's another thing, right, too, is like, okay, if you guys are setting this standard now, Why doesn't the standard applying to all these other things that the like the election date timeline affects? You guys are kind of picking and choosing what you want to apply this definition to. And again, this is a definition that isn't even the definition that Virginia law already defines. Does this mean that the courts are effectively hamstrung? Okay. By some assessment, both sides are made reasonable. No, they're not. They're really not. In solidly sourced arguments, but the degree to which they fixate on the definition of election seem to strike at least. But by the way, this entire, like most of this article is about what is defined as an election day. By digging into the weeds of this, we're pretending that this is even a reasonable question to ask. We have to take a step back and remember that step one process of the amendment process has nothing to do with the general election. So why are we spending our entire time pretending that this whole election argument is even a reasonable argument to be having? When we do that, we allow Republicans to shift the conversation away from a more important question, which is, why are you guys not following what the Constitution of Virginia says? Why are you making this about the general election? It has nothing, step one has nothing to do with that. But that's why it's a red herring. A red herring is a distraction. We're distracted away from what the actual core of the issue is. And now we're arguing over what is the definition of an election day. And even by that standard, their definition of election day doesn't even follow the Virginia Constitution. Seem to strike at least one analysis pedantic. Vox Ian Millhiser put it this way: rather than producing two eye-glazing opinions fighting over the meaning of a word whose definition appears to shift depending on both linguistic and historical context, the justices would have produced a better opinion if they'd asked a more basic question. What is the relevant provision of the Virginia Constitution actually supposed to accomplish? The more basic question is, in some ways, harder to answer. The court's majority wrote that the laborious process of amending the Constitution gives voters an indirect and direct opportunity to voice their views on a proposed change. Voting for it against, but also this is incorrect. These people keep misunderstanding. Like, step one has nothing to do with the voters' will. It doesn't. It has to do with the state. It has to do with the legislators in Congress vote. Voting for and against legislators' initial approve on amendment and then voting on the amendment itself. But if the justices were concerned about the will of the 1.3 million early voters who cast their ballots before the legislature approved the redistricting amendment, they seem to gloss over the more than 1.6 million Virginians who voted in favor of the new maps. Okay, so what they're saying here is that if you're concerned about, the voters didn't get a chance to express their position on this amendment in step one, well, why are you ignoring the fact that they already did that in step three? In step three, even more Virginians actually voted in favor of it. Why are you ignoring that? How can they say the voters didn't have a say? The voters had a say in a clear majority. The text of the Virginia Constitution doesn't expand on why the constitutional amendment process is structured the way it is. But what it does say is illuminating, says Quinn Yergain, a law professor at Michigan State University. Virginia's previous constitution in 1902 specified that legislature must publicize a proposed amendment to voters 3 months before the intervening election. When the Constitution was revised in 1971, the requirement was omitted. So understand here that this process right here, which is their constitutional process for amending the Constitution, this process itself was amended. There was a different process before 1902. And after 1902, they explicitly removed the part of the old version that said that at step one, you had to make the amendment, you had to publicize it to the voters. Even the old version doesn't say that the voters vote on it at step one. It just says that it gets publicized to the voters in step one. And if I looked into this, I'm willing to, it doesn't matter, but I bet if I looked into this, the results of step one were actually publicized. I guess maybe they were publicized after people already voted, but it doesn't really matter because step one, the new version of the amendment process, which is, this is the law of the state, it doesn't require that. So they effectively made it easier then to amend the Constitution. At that point, they knew exactly how to use the words to achieve the kind of thing the majority said it was trying to achieve, and they took those words out. And of course, the Supreme Court of Virginia, the ones who voted against it, they ignored that. Democratic officials in Virginia have asked the U.S. Supreme Court to reinstate the U.S. Supreme Court, the federal court. Now, think about it. The federal court went out of its way to, in the past couple of years, the Supreme Court at the federal level has gone out of its way to intervene at the state level to stay orders. When I say stay order, it means that a lower level court made an order and the Supreme Court comes along and says, hey, wait a second. Ignore that order by that lower level court. We're going to review it and we get the final say. But while we're waiting for us to review it and have our final say, that lower level court, their order is not in effect. So the Supreme Court of the United States at the upper level that's skewed for Republicans has year over year gone out of its way to intervene at the state level to stop the state courts from getting in the way of what Republicans have been doing at the state level and saying, hey, you can't stop them. Wait a minute, we get to review it. And what they've also been doing is they've been taking their sweet fucking time, allowing Republicans to do things at the state level that their own state courts have said they're not allowed to do. And then the Supreme Court says, hey, we're not allowing you to stop Republicans at the state level from doing those things until we've had a chance to look at it. And then they conveniently take their sweet time until it's too late for the ruling to have an effect. So not only are they doing that, they went out of their way, like in this case, this Louisiana versus Calais case, to overturn the voting rights provisions of the Voting Rights Act to allow Republicans to do stuff. But when it comes to this case, this Virginia case, the Supreme Court at the federal level, when it comes to Democrats, the Supreme Court refused to take up this ruling. They refused to intervene on it. Even though when you look at the details of this ruling, you could see the details of this ruling, it's very clear and obvious logically, deductively, that this is not a good ruling. This is a partisan ruling. This is a ruling that isn't in comportment with what the actual law says. And yet conveniently, the Supreme Court that's gone out of its way to protect Republican gerrymandering refused to take up this case. After the Supreme Court's Voting Rights Act decision in Louisiana versus Calais made it harder for voters of color to challenge redistricting plans as discriminatory, southern states have scrambled to redraw their congressional maps in ways that favor the GOP. In some cases, after early votes and here's the other thing, after early votes in primary elections had already been counted. So Republicans get to do it. Supreme Court doesn't have an issue with it. The courts at the state level, which are skewed Republican, also don't have an issue with it. But Democrats try to do it. Their constitution doesn't even say that they can't do it, and yet they stop them anyways. The new maps will make this year's House elections the least competitive on record. The current redistricting war makes it for a deeply dissatisfying situation from beginning to end. Okay. Instead, we're asking a broader question, and it's whether year's congressional elections are going to be legitimate. Okay. Yeah. So you get the idea there. All right. So that's the whole context in which we get to this conversation here between Pisco, AJW, moderated by Brad Polumbo. We're going to speed this up a little bit because we can be here for forever. We don't want to do that. And let's get this going.
Stephen Miller. I'm not going to lie, just the extreme aggression. Can you fight fascism by acting like fascists? That's how some Democrats want to respond after the state Supreme Court in Virginia.
No, they don't. We really, as a society, and it's incumbent upon the media to have some responsibility here. Fascism has a definition. We got to stop doing this thing where people in politics get to manipulate the terminology to confuse the population. Fascism is not just authoritarianism. It's authoritarian nationalism. Nothing the Democrats have been doing, even if you want to argue it's authoritarian, nothing they've been doing has been in service to nationalism. It's not authoritarian nationalism. It's not fascism.
Virginia just struck down their gerrymandering efforts. The context here is that Virginia is something of a purple state, although it leans much more Democratic these days than it once did. But after multiple red states recently gerrymandered their congressional districts to boost the Republicans' chances before the 2026 midterm election, Democratic state legislators in Virginia responded by trying to do the same. They pushed through a last-minute ballot measure that was then narrowly approved that would seek to circumvent their constitutional amendment, which required congressional districts to be drawn fairly by an independent commission. And the point of this referendum was to allow them to essentially skew their map so they could get 10-to-1 Democratic representation rather than the current 6-to-5 balance. But the state Supreme Court just struck down this referendum result, ruling on procedural grounds that the proper process and procedure wasn't followed here, so it violated the state constitution and was null and void. This isn't a partisan MAGA high court ruling. One of the justices of the 4 that ruled in favor of striking down the referendum was actually appointed with Democratic support in the state legislature. Regardless, some Democratic leaders are responding to this ruling by going absolutely ape and threatening to blow up the state of Virginia's entire system of government. As the New York Times reported, at a meeting behind closed doors featuring members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress from Virginia, and the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, they discussed drastic steps like possibly forcing every single justice to retire by lowering the retirement age and packing the court full of Democratic appointees, because that's a perfectly normal thing to do. In reality, packing the courts when they don't rule your way is an authoritarian tactic, and that's why you typically
In a vacuum, it is, right? But if you are trying to counter a party that's trying to unilaterally take control of every branch of government, trying to balance that out, the motivation there isn't because you want to have a one-party dictatorship and you want to corrupt the country. It's because you are trying to protect yourselves from the corruption of the other side, right? We have to look at the motivation. We can't pretend that this happens in a vacuum.
typically see it from despots in places like Hungary or Venezuela. To be fair, Democrats, while they're certainly being hyperbolic when they cry about fascism and authoritarianism under President Trump,
We're not. I mean, if you actually understand the definition of fascism, Trump's behavior is authoritarian. His consolidation of power is authoritarian. The corruption is authoritarian. And it is in service to nationalism. That is what fascism is. It's not hyperbolic. People just get triggered by that word.
they do have a point that he's taken some authoritarian steps, like weaponizing government to target his political opponents and trying to punish media outlets he dislikes. But is the right response to a president you say is a threat to the rule of law really to one-up him? Especially since, even without these skewed maps in Virginia, Democrats still have a very good chance of winning the midterm election.
So this entire debate is going to be centered around, at least between Brad Polumbo and Pisco. AJW is a right-wing grifter. He's going to be dishonest about this whole thing. But I think Brad is a good faith actor. I think he maybe just doesn't see the things that, liberal voters and Democrats see. But I think he's reasonable enough to hear out the opposition and reconsider things. But between him and Pisco, the disagreement is going to be between this idea of, is Democrats trying to pack that Supreme Court based on that ruling? Is it a proportionate response? Is it tit for tat, or is it going even beyond? Is it, if someone cut you in line, if you were to punch them in the back of the head, that wouldn't be considered a proportionate response, right? Someone cuts you in line, you should be allowed to have some sort of response, right? To try to get that person to not cut you in line or whatever it may be, right? But punching in the back of the head would be considered an escalation that's beyond the pale. That's the question here. Is Brad sees Democrats trying to pack that court now as a disproportionate response. And Pisco is going to try to make the argument that actually these are tit for tat things. This is a reasonable proportionate response. And, Republicans gerrymandering and court packing in other states, or court stacking in other states, is in effect the goal, the motivation, the effect of those things are basically the same as if Democrats were to try to pack the Virginia Supreme Court now.
So if
It's not like a difference in kind. It's not like a huge escalation. It's not like a disproportionate response. It's a proportionate response. It's trying to meet like for like kind of thing. So that's the argument he's going to try to make.
They should focus on making their case to the public, not flirt with fighting fascism by acting kind of fascist. That's just my take, and the debate is only just beginning. Let's get into it. All right, guys, welcome back to Brad versus the World. I'm now joined by the left-wing streamer and lawyer, Pisco Liddy, and the right-wing YouTuber, Sean Fitzgerald, also known as Actual Justice Warrior. Guys, thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you for having me.
So, Pisco, I'll come to you first. Give us your take on the Democratic gerrymandering efforts being thwarted by the state Supreme Court, and whether you should really support going nuclear on the state Supreme Court as a result.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me again. And it's a really important issue, and one that even though it's probably not going to get implemented because the Democrats in Virginia, including Governor Vanderger, don't want to implement it, it's still relevant because it talks about and it references sort of our overall position on court packing generally, and the growing, I think, consensus among Democrats that it's justified, including me, who thinks it's justified to pack the Supreme Court of the United States. I'm in support of this measure, and I would support Virginia Democrats doing it if it were to.
There's another point they're going to get into. I don't think, again, I listened to this when I was driving the other day. I don't think Pisco makes a good point of this. This is something that Democrats need to communicate to the public. A lot of times other people, they're just not making the same connections that we're making. We can't take for granted that they are. A lot of people think court stacking, which is what Republicans have already done, is different from court packing. And in reality, court packing and court stacking are both used to accomplish the same goal. It's to shift the partisan balance of the court. And the issue with that, of course, is that we don't want our courts to be partisan. We want them to be fair and neutral, right? Court stacking is when you use political maneuvering to shift the balance of the court, but not by changing the size of the court. So you might do things like the Republicans did, which is you deny the other party the ability to seat their own court justices, even when they win elections. And then you change the rules for your side so that you guys could ram through justices on your side. That's court stacking. You're doing it so you could change the partisan lean of the court in a way that's unfair to the other side, but you're not technically changing the size of the court. Court packing is you're changing the size of the court. You're saying, okay, this court is skewed, or it's imbalanced, or it's skewed, or whatever. We want to skew it the other way. So instead of like stacking, we're just gonna, there's 9 justices, let's say, we're just gonna add a few more seats, and now we're gonna add a few seats that are our seats. And now we've changed the lean of the court by adding seats. But these two processes, stacking and packing, one is not better than the other. They're just different ways of accomplishing the same goal. And I think a lot of voters don't understand that, because court packing is a scary term. It's in our lexicon, because court packing became a conversation, an argument to be had when FDR in the 1940s, I think, attempted to pack the courts. And so it became a big conversation, a big topic of conversation. Court stacking has not been a major topic of conversation. I don't think most people even know what court stacking is. So court packing sounds scary to most people because we all know that it's bad and it's partisan. Court stacking accomplishes the same thing, but the public doesn't have the awareness that it's basically the same thing. It's just a different way of getting to the same thing.
To happen. And the reason for that is simple. One is it doesn't violate what I consider to be a fundamental norm of representative government. Just like partisan gerrymandering, having a winner's edge in the context of partisan gerrymandering, no one really thinks that playing on a level playing field when it comes to partisan gerrymandering in some states, when Republicans are doing it, that it's not justified for Democrats to respond in kind. The same is true when it comes to packing the courts.
If there was a Republican doesn't violate norms,
it doesn't. The legislatures are given the authority to.
That doesn't mean it doesn't violate norms, though.
No. So the question is, what are you allowed to do in response to an initial norm violation? So you would agree, wouldn't you, Brad, that if the Republicans court packed a given state, that it would be justified to do it in response, correct?
Yeah, or to try to undo it in whatever way. But yes.
Correct. So no one.
They didn't pack the court in Virginia, though.
No, but in the nationwide context, right? All of this needs to be seen in a nationwide context. We're in a more national environment these days.
Can we start by talking about Virginia and then talk about maybe the Supreme Court?
Okay, so this is the disconnect that Brad has and a lot of members of the public might have. He thinks that malfeasance at the state level is contained within the state level. Like I said earlier, gerrymandering and having a court that is able to rule on your gerrymandering affects the national level, affects all of us, because those state legislatures also get to draw the districts that are the House of Representative districts that go to the federal level. And so it's not just contained to the states, it affects the entire country. But I don't think Brad realizes that connection. And it's incumbent upon Pisco. I'm trying to remember if he did really a great job here. I think he did an okay job here, but it's incumbent upon us to make that clear to people. People need to be aware that what happens in Virginia or Ohio or wherever, Texas, these gerrymanders, they affect the entire country, not just the state.
So
Virginia, what is the norm
justification? You're asking for the justification, and that justification is inherently related to other states.
All right,
so you can't say, well, remove. Okay, so in Utah, in Georgia, in Arizona, Republicans did a court pack. That is absolutely unrebutted. Everyone agrees that that's the case. And they did it for explicitly partisan reasons. And it is the case that the judiciary has checks on it. That includes checks from the legislature. And no one's questioning, right? And to the extent that there are questions, those will be resolved in the courts if they were to implement this, that the legislature does have that checking authority. So in response to Republican court packs, when they didn't like the results of their elections as it relates to, the decisions of their Supreme Courts.
By the way, that's a good way of framing it too, which is that, and it's true, right? The legislature's ability to change the size of the court or to impeach people in the court or to remove people from the court, that is a check and balance power. It's not like, I think because we don't do it very much, it's seen as like a transgression for the legislature to come in and start manipulating the court. But that is part of the system being designed the way that it is that ideally we don't want it to happen. And under normal circumstances, it doesn't happen. But they do have that check and balance power reserved in situations like this, where if the court becomes corrupted, if the court is issuing rulings that aren't even, like, they don't even have the authority to issue, because you should not have the authority to issue rulings where you're making up law that actually isn't there. Being able to impeach or to change the size of the court or to remove people from the court, that is a check and balance power in order to keep one of the branches from becoming corrupted.
When it comes to gerrymandering, the Democrats, just like they would be in the context of a gerrymander in the federal Supreme Court, which I think we had, a non-legislative gerrymander, they're allowed to respond in kind. And I think it's totally justified on that view.
All right, Sean, your take here.
Yeah, so I mean, this obviously violates the norms. I think the New York Times article said they were going to lower the age to the lowest age of a current Virginia sitting Supreme Court justice. I don't know if another state in recent history got rid of the entirety of their Supreme Court because they didn't like one specific ruling, which, by the way, they're the ones who put in this Virginia redistricting ban at the constitutional level in the first place, and they did it back in 2020. So they're immediately trying to reverse it. They didn't follow the basic procedures. Everybody knew that they weren't doing it. This is why the Republicans didn't spend as
Again, we went over this. We just spent like an hour going over this. When they say they didn't follow the procedure, to the average person who's reading headlines and stuff, that seems reasonable. I thought that was the case until you dive into it and you realize that there's nothing in the procedures that actually requires them at that step one to get a vote from the voters of the state. That happens at step 3. So when they say it doesn't follow the procedures, they're not being honest about this, or they're misunderstanding what the process is.
as much money in the actual, ballot initiative campaign as the Democrats. We all understood that this was going to be up to the courts, and now that they lost, they're going to throw a fit. And of course, there's the national justification that, it's going to happen at the Supreme Court too, because they're losing cases at the Supreme Court because they were outmaneuvered by Republicans. By the way, part of the way they were
Notice, when he's describing what Democrats have done, he describes them as norm violations, and he describes them as a bad thing. When he's describing Republicans, he calls it outmaneuvering. Well, the outmaneuvering that he's talking about are norm violations by Republicans. But notice that he characterizes those two things differently to give the audience a different impression that when Republicans do it, they're just playing the game and it's fair rules in the game. They just won the game. You guys lost. When Democrats are doing it, even though they're also playing by the rules of the game, technically, it's a norm violation.
Maneuvered is they got rid of the filibuster for judicial nominees. So Republicans countered that by getting rid of it for Supreme Court nominees. So they were able to claim extra Supreme Court seats based on that. So yeah, like this stuff backfires constantly. And it's absolutely a violation of norms to get rid of your entire Supreme Court because you don't like a decision, which, by the way, the plain reading of the Virginia law would have validated that court's appeal or that court's ruling.
If you're here late, you can go back and watch my stream, probably the last 45 minutes. There's nothing in the plain reading of the Virginia constitutional amendment process that says what he's saying. It's not there. They're making that up. I'm not even like, I'm not even talking about like interpretations. I'm talking like literally the text right there, demonstrably, you can read it. It's just literally not there. They're making it up.
Yeah, I mean, listen, regardless, and I don't want to get too buried down into the weeds of whether or not the state Supreme Court decision in Virginia was correct, right? I know, Pisco, you're a lawyer, but the others of us are not, and I don't want to I think it's a more fundamental question is what do you do when you are stymied by a high court? And I understand, I've seen you and others in kind of your ideological camp point to examples like Utah. I don't think, while I do oppose what they did in Utah in terms of adding additional justices to the state Supreme Court, it's not quite the same scenario. For example, every sitting justice was already a Republican appointed justice, and they added 2 more Republican appointed justices, which wasn't even enough because you were right, they were frustrated by the outcomes of some of decisions against them. That's not even the margin by which they were losing those cases. So I think it's an inappropriate measure that I'm totally against, but I don't think it's an apples to apples comparison, let alone a justification for totally nuking a state Supreme Court. Like, you acknowledge if they actually did this, what some of these Democratic lawmakers have come out in favor of from Virginia, and they removed via the retirement age every single sitting Supreme Court justice.
One would be left.
Maybe one would be left, and then stack the bench. You acknowledge they'd basically just be nuking the Supreme Court of Virginia.
They would be removing, it would be exactly what you're talking about. It's a form of court packing. You agree with that, don't you? It's a form of court packing.
Yes, that's court packing.
Okay. So you're saying that there's a difference between what the Democrats would do by using the retirement age versus what was done in Utah, Georgia, Arizona. I'm asking, in virtue of what is it different?
Maximally more extreme.
Why? The question is
Forcing
why not
the entire court to retire.
But no one cares about the actual composition, right? What they care about are the results. That's why people are doing these kinds of tricks,
I just
right?
explained how the results in Utah are quite different.
No. But what is the goal in the Utah gerrymander? The goal in the Utah gerrymander is to get to partisan results, isn't it? You agree with that?
I think that was the motivation. It doesn't appear to really have worked.
So, wait, is
Right,
it the goal or the result that matters? Because you're like, nobody cares about the goal.
The result is the goal. That's the point. These aren't distinct things. The whole point of doing these gerrymanders and stacking the courts is to shift the institutions to be partisan leaning for the Republican Party. That is the goal. That is the result. Those are the same things. And so if Democrats are doing their own, whatever legal or political things that they have to do to counter that, even though they might be using different tools, at the end of the day, they're all reaching the same result. They're trying to balance out those efforts to skew the balance of our institutions.
Goals, they care about the results, and then you're like, what is the goal in Utah? So is it the goal or the results?
So it's both. It's what the goals are and what are the results in the given states. So but the more important thing is, what is the norm violation, right? No one in principle has a problem with increasing the number of seats on a given court or setting a retirement age. Agreed?
Doing it in a partisan way for partisan advantage is the problem.
Okay, right. So we agree that there's nothing inherently about setting a retirement age or about adding additional members to the Supreme Court that is wrong. What's the problem is what's the motivation, right? The motivation. If you're trying to do something for a partisan edge, that's considered the impermissible rationale. And what I agree that that's not the world that I want to live in. But you have to, if you're operating in a space in which the other side is doing the same exact thing, right? By which I mean the norm-breaking nature of it is affecting the composition of the court for partisan reasons. That's at the end of the day the fundamental comparison, and it's apples to apples. That's back to what.
That's kind of back to what I said at the beginning, though, which is fighting what you call a threat to the rule of law, and I do agree in terms of the MAGA movement in its current form, by yourself assaulting the rule of law. You would turn the Virginia State Supreme Court into a partisan joke.
When you say that it's an assault on the rule of law, is that your way of saying that it's illegal?
No, those aren't.
Okay, so what do you mean when you say it's assault on the rule of law?
It utterly destroys and neuters the principle of judicial independence that allows it to serve as a legitimate check and balance in our system of government, is what I mean.
But you would be in favor of it if it was a retaliatory measure. So the harder question for you to answer is,
I'd be in favor of it if it was a retaliatory measure.
Yes, I think you granted that. So I'll ask the question then to make it simple. If it were the case that Utah did the exact same thing that's being proposed by Virginia Democrats in this context, would you be in favor of Democrats responding in kind if it were the case that they were doing that retirement age play in Utah?
No, I would be okay with them maybe trying to resolve.
By the way, this is why I say, like, Brad is not like a liberal or a Democrat, but I don't. It's very rare for me to say this these days, but I still feel like I have respect for him because I don't think he comes at things from like a bad faith perspective, and I think that he tries to be fair, even if I think he's not seeing what we're seeing. When you see him look up, this is a basic body language thing. When someone's thinking about something, maybe they haven't thought before, they're contemplating it. They look up, right? Like you asked me a question, like, who did you used to hang out with when you were in the third grade? Oh fuck, the third grade, right? And you're looking up and you're thinking about it. It's because you're having to think about it. These are, in this case, kind of like what I was saying here. These are probably questions that Brad hasn't really had to grapple with. So oftentimes as liberals and Democrats in the movement, we get frustrated because it feels like everybody around us is being bad faith, is being unfair with us. And there are a lot of people that are like that. AJW is going to be one of those people. But there are also a lot of people out there that actually genuinely don't understand what we're seeing. And we have to like make the case. We have to explain it to them. And then light bulbs start going off in their head. It's incumbent for us to actually do that. It's important that we do that.
Of the situation in Utah, but I don't really subscribe to the race to the bottom, two wrongs make a right style of political philosophy and strategy.
And this is what we're so sick of, right? So on that view, right, if the Republicans did a legislative a court pack in the federal Supreme Court, if they did that, if they passed the number of, in Congress and they had it approved by the president and they increased the number of seats to 13, that's Republicans. You'd be against Democrats doing it in kind.
I think they would kind of have to do it in kind, but
that's
why
the question isn't whether they would have to do it. The question isn't whether they would have to do it. It's would you be okay with them doing it? And now it seems like you're suggesting you don't want to race to the bottom, so you wouldn't be in favor in the federal context of, in response to a partisan increase in the number of seats on the court, for Democrats to respond in kind. That can't be the playing field that we live in.
This can't be, by the way, because I understand Brad's concern, and it's a reasonable concern, which is like, we don't want a situation where the country is just getting more extreme because one side does something bad, the other side does something bad, and then we're all just racing to the bottom. We're getting more and more extreme, more and more corrupt over time. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. But the question is, how do you actually keep that from happening? And if your position is that you're like Republicans are going to do things that are corrupt and skew the balance of our institutions, but you don't want Democrats to respond, that can't be the world that we're living in, because you're asking half of the country to submit themselves to having their rights and representation stripped away and subjugated by the other half of the country without any ability for them to rebalance things or have any kind of consequences for the side that is actively making an effort to strip them of rights and representation. That can't be the world that we live in. I understand that the scenario where these sides are going back and forth isn't ideal either. I understand that. But what do you want us to do? What option do we have? You're leaving us in a situation where we don't have the option. We don't want to do this. Democrats don't want to do this. Democrats have moved for national bans on gerrymandering in the states that they control. They voted to turn them into nonpartisan districting commissions. We don't want to do this. We don't want to. Just like somebody that has a gun doesn't want to shoot somebody, but if somebody is in their house trying to be frank, rape their wife and children, you're not going to sit there and do nothing. You don't want to shoot somebody, but you have to in that scenario. It's not an ideal scenario. It's not something that we choose to find ourselves in, but we can't live in a world where we just let people barge into people's houses and assault people. We can't do that. Sorry.
I think they would. I think I would ultimately be okay with them doing it, but I would, at that point, once one person packs the Supreme Court, the entire Supreme Court is cooked. So I'm trying to stop that first hurdle from getting there. I want to bring Sean in here.
And see, he doesn't make that connection I mentioned earlier. He thinks packing and stacking are fundamentally different. He thinks, oh, once one side has packed the court, then it's gone too far. Then that race to the bottom is triggered. No, that race to the bottom has already been triggered because Republicans stacked the court. Like I said earlier, stacking and packing, why are they bad? They're not bad just because it's stacking isn't bad for stacking's sake. Packing isn't bad for packing's sake. The reason those things are bad is because they corrupt the balance of these institutions. And stacking and packing both corrupt the balance of the courts. They just do it in different ways. Brad doesn't realize that slippery slope where everybody's rushing to the bottom, it's already been triggered by the Republican Party because he doesn't understand that stacking is accomplishing the same thing as packing.
What you to realize is it's already happened, right?
So in the context of what we disagree, but we'll come back to that. I want to bring in Sean here, though.
Sure. It's happened in another state. Like if Democrats took control in Utah and they utilized the same process,
there's that disconnect between state level versus national.
It is connected. Utah, then that would be perfectly fine. It's the same area, it's the same arena, and the norm was broken on the other side first. If Virginia, they end up getting rid of all the Supreme Court justices, and like every 4 years, Virginia has a governor partisan flip almost every 4 years to Republicans, and then they did that, then, it's not good for the country that it keeps happening even in these state courts, but
it's not good. It's almost like Republicans should stop playing these games, but they don't want to. He knows that. AJW knows that. It's not that he doesn't want a scenario where we're doing things like this that are corrupt and everything. He just wants his side to be able to do it and the rest of us to not do anything in response. They want to subjugate half of the country and they don't want us to do anything about it.
Understandable because it's in the same arena. And in the federal context, if Democrats, they're the ones trying to expand to 13 justices, end up doing that, and then suddenly the Republicans are like, well, now we need 17 justices. I mean, it's going to ruin the Supreme Court. We should all acknowledge that. Like, you're breaking the norm.
By the way, like this idea that he has, like, once Democrats do it, it's going to have a back and forth, and the back and forth is bad and everything. He doesn't even consider that Republicans already doing it is already triggering that negative feedback loop. Because in his mind, Republicans have been trained to think that they are allowed to do things like this. They think Democrats aren't going to respond because historically we haven't responded. So in his mind, the idea of them doing these sorts of things to him, he doesn't even the connection between them doing that and this race to the bottom, it doesn't even factor in because they just like instinctually, intuitively, the idea that Democrats are even going to respond isn't even there.
Arms, and it just basically pressures everybody into continuously doing this. That's the whole threat of court packing historically, is that you want to push the court in your direction. So it was used as an intimidation tactic by Roosevelt back in the day. But like, if you actually do it, then it undermines your judiciary completely, because if you don't like the way something's shaking down.
Again, they don't see their own behavior that way. Like stacking the court like corrupts the balance of the court, of course. But like he doesn't acknowledge, or he doesn't see that his side is already doing that.
you could just flood it with justices. We could end up in, 25 years with 100 Supreme Court justices if we go down this track. But yeah, it's in Virginia we're talking about, and it's based on a ruling that they didn't like in Virginia. You're trying to use other contexts in Utah, which again, if they fight that battle in Utah, that's one thing because norms would have been broken there, but that doesn't change the way Virginia should work.
Yeah, so I think you give the whole game away there, right? Let's focus on first what we all have agreement with. We all agree that retaliatory measures, assuming you're part of the quote same arena, that's justified. I wanted to make sure everyone here agrees that if we consider the same arena, whatever this means, and we'll get into that, retaliatory packing is justified, correct?
It's justifiable. I don't know if it's still
Wait,
like
what's the difference between
system
justified and justifiable?
Like you can make
that's
you
a
can make a
distinction you know I'm going to call you on.
you can make a good argument for it, but it still ends up leading
I'm asking
to a race
your
to the
view.
bottom.
I'm not. So I'm asking your view. If it's the case that it's the same arena,
call it out,
would it
but
be
it's like
justified?
I wouldn't call it out as like some.
Notice the slipperiness, this inability to just answer straightforward. I would call it out, but I don't know if I'm not asking you if you're going to call it out. I'm going to ask you, what is your principle?
Some unprecedented maneuver if you're doing it back to somebody, but
That's not
it makes
the
the
question.
system worse.
I'm not asking would you call it one thing or the other.
I'm explaining the answer. You're just like harping on it. Just get to your overall point.
No,
I would not call out. I would not call out
fact,
Democrats for doing this in Utah. I would not call out if Democrats pass this, Republicans for doing this back in Virginia.
Because it would be justified. You wouldn't call it
because
out.
I understand the rationale, but I will say it does degrade the system, which is the broader point that I'm trying to make. But yeah, I get what you're saying. The what do you call it? Like unilateral disarmament, not a good idea. I understand. It's just justified. Like gives it like an air of like morality.
So the question
is 100% clear.
Only so the question isn't what you would call out. The question isn't what you would feel someone could make a conceivably good argument about.
Yeah, okay.
The question is guys, only would it be justified?
I don't want you to talk over each other.
Ask.
I don't want you to talk over each other. Sean, like, so in this scenario that Pisco.
This is good moderation. A lot of moderators don't do this these days in media. Like a lot of times we have these people, these political talking heads, they won't answer a straight question. They'll try to dance around it. They'll waste a lot of fucking time like playing these word games and everything. This is good moderation. Brad cuts in. Conversation's getting off track. It's getting redundant. One of the people are unwilling to engage in good faith. He's going to interject to say, hey, recenter things. Can you answer that question, please?
I was describing if you, for example, take for granted that Republicans pack the Supreme Court, yes or no, would Democrats be justified in doing so in retaliation?
If they actually pass the Supreme Court, it's totally justifiable to do so.
There we go.
Again,
now
it degrades the system for sure, but
so
I get the rationale and I understand the argument about unilateral disarmament. I get all that, but I'm just saying it also does degrade the system to continuously do this. That's the point.
So there's only two possible distinctions then on the Virginia point, right? The two possible distinctions are as follows. A, that it's not in the right arena. So that's one.
No one has packed the Virginia State Supreme Court. You agree with that?
No one has packed the Virginia Supreme Court, as far as I know. Yes, no.
So you would be beginning to pack
but that's begging the question of what the right arena is. So that's one way in which you could try to distinguish the action is say it's a different arena. And then two is you could say, well, the action is just fundamentally different. Getting rid of judges is different in a way that matters than adding members of the Supreme Court. So those are the two distinctions that I've heard you guys offer. And here's to rebut them. Number one, you guys are kidding yourself. It's not in the same arena. Of course it is. You can't have it both ways. All the arguments for partisan gerrymandering when it comes to Texas, when it comes to the response to Virginia in the first place, when it comes to California, everyone understands that this is in a national context. For us to arbitrarily draw the line and say, okay, the norm violation matters, but only in the context of Virginia, or partisan gerrymandering norms only matter in the context of one state, I just don't agree with that as overall in terms of the rationale for retaliatory measures. The rationale for retaliatory measures, I think, is only arbitrarily to be limited to the jurisdiction of the state.
Do you acknowledge that it's an escalation, though, to go from, for example, adding 2 Supreme Court justices, even though that wasn't really a strictly partisan thing in Utah, but even taking that at face value, adding 2. So if retaliation would be Virginia adding 2 justices, not Virginia forcing all but 1 to retire and nuking the whole court, basically. That's escalation.
It's like a proportionality critique, right? That it's not proportional, even if you grant that it's retaliatory in some sense. And
that would be a big escalation.
Okay, so I'll deal with the proportionality thing, but let's just get off the table the notion this is not partisan in nature. And to the extent that it's like, well, it's overdetermined because they're just Republicans anyway, it's to get their policy choices implemented. So regardless of whether or not it is dispositive in the overall, like, who nominated who question, that no one cares about that. What they care about are the rulings. And that's what they're trying to eschew when it comes to partisan balance. Now, on proportionality, no, I think that absolutely it's, it's not exactly the same as 2. I would agree it is intensifying it, but just because you're not required in terms of retaliation, I agree it's escalatory, but in terms of retaliation, I don't think that only things that are exactly the same are justified in retaliation. I think that you're able to go a little bit further. And this to me,
that's how you get a race to the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay, but assuming the conditions that I set out, we have agreement. Now, you guys disagree that you can consider Utah when you're considering Virginia. You want to put blinders on and say, I only consider what's happening in Virginia for the purpose of Virginia. It's a totally, in my view, arbitrary way to look at this nationwide picture on gerrymandering and when it comes to the norms of our country vis-a-vis state judges. I think it's totally abnormal to look at it that way.
Let's zoom out here a little bit.
Hold on.
Okay, go ahead.
So, I mean, I made this point. I think he's right, but I think he could have done a better job actually explaining, because I don't think Brad makes the connection that a gerrymander and courts that are skewed in a state, they do affect the national level, which means they affect all of the other states. It's not just contained to Virginia or Ohio, because those state legislatures determine like the voting rights of members or of citizens in their state. They determine the districts for the House of Representatives that get sent to the federal government. It's not just contained to Virginia. And by the way, when I say that they determine the voting rights and rules in their state, that also affects the national level, because the vote for president is a national level vote, but the rules around that are determined at the state level. Same thing for the House of Representatives, like I mentioned before. So it's not contained, but Pisco needs to actually kind of make that connection for them, because I don't think Brad sees that. I think AJW knows, he's just pretending to be stupid. But
with the nationwide gerrymandering, like neither of us are bringing up California, which followed their own constitution. They ended up passing their gerrymandering in response to Texas, and like we're not arguing that because they're not taking the extra.
See, AJW, like he pretended earlier he didn't see the connection between these different states' behaviors, right? But now he's pointing out that he does actually understand the connection. And that's how you can kind of tell sometimes when people are being bad faith and dishonest.
Extra step of basically eliminating any even perceived independence in their judiciary in order to secure a short-term victory. Like Virginia had a process. They could have done this before, but you had Spamberger in part campaigning on her not doing this. She said this prior to the election.
So I looked this up earlier. The reason that Spamberger changed her mind on that was because Republican mid-decade redistricting that Donald Trump was pushing on Republican states. So she didn't initially run on it, but AJW's he's portraying this as if Abigail Spamberger is a hypocrite, rather than Abigail Spamberger changing her opinion in response to what Republicans were doing
back in 2025, and then they decided to rush it through during the period of time where they already had mail-in voting, and it ended up undermining them. So like that was the issue that they had, or early voting if it wasn't mail-in voting. So excuse me for getting that wrong.
Yeah, no, that's the merits of the opinion, and I couldn't disagree more on the merits of the procedural issue. But I don't want to get
let's not go
there.
down. Yeah, let's not go down that lane.
But what you did there when you said about California, that's.
We really should, though. The media is not doing enough talking about the actual merits of the case. Again, if you're turning in late, I did a whole hour going through the merits of the case. Once you actually look at the merits of the case, it's insane. It's crazy. The rationale doesn't make any sense. But nobody's talking about it. So nobody's aware of that. Everybody thinks that the merits of the case are like, okay, they're really not.
Beautiful what you just said there, Sean, because you're giving the game away, right? Because we would all agree that California, the context in which partisan gerrymandering retaliation is justified in California, is in virtue of what happened in Texas, right?
Well,
so
let me ask you on that directly, actually. Yeah. So do you acknowledge, because I would say that I do think this is true, that President Trump started this current race to the bottom. And I think we got to do something about partisan gerrymandering broadly. It's a huge, horrific, awful practice. But it seems to me that President Trump started the current race to the bottom, or Republicans broadly did, by pressuring Texas to try to stop themselves from, bleeding out in 2020.
Oh, my bad. I realized I had this on mute. The point that I was making is that it's a historic view to think that this whole thing started in 2025 recently with Donald Trump. Donald Trump escalated it, but Republicans have been escalating this for the last 20 years. In the 2010s, let's just go through some of this. There was an entire national strategy by the Republican Party. So 2010s was largely defined by Project Red Map. This is the name for their strategy. A highly successful $30 million strategy launched by the Republican Senate Leadership Committee. To be honest with you, $30 million is pretty cheap for all of the political, for what they got out of it, ahead of the 2010 census. So they were targeting swing states. Republicans targeted key swing states with split governments or narrow legislative majorities right before districts were redrawn, specifically focusing on states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, North Carolina, 5 of them, right? There's probably more in there. But I just want you to keep in mind as we're going through this, not just that both sides have done it, but you need to understand the scope and scale to which the Republicans have been doing it. It's not even remotely close to the same. By flipping 117 legislative seats in 2010, Republicans secured trifectas, controlled both the legislative chambers and the governorships in 17 states. That trifecta, legislature and the governorship, allows them also then to capture the courts. So the courts, the court justices are usually nominated by the executive. In this case, would be the governor. Then they're confirmed by the legislative branch. So if you have both the legislature and the governor, you're able to then get the courts. Now understand that now you're controlling all 3 branches of government. And now there isn't really an effective check and balance on between these separate branches of government because you've taken control of all 3 of them. Surgical line drawing, armed with sophisticated GIS mapping. This would be like well, we can look this up, but this is basically like GPS kind of. GIS. Geographic information systems. It's basically like kind of like GPS, but it's like looking at information and data geographically. Mapping software and vast data profiles. Operative used 2 main techniques to delete the power of Democratic voters: packing and cracking. So 2012 elections, despite Democrats winning 1.4 million more votes nationwide in the U.S. House of Representatives, Republicans retained control of the chamber by a 234 to 201 margin. Understand that, by the way. Even though Democrats are winning, like there's more voters voting for them, the actual representation in Congress, they have less than the Republicans. Now, Republicans will often argue like, hey, what do you want? You want to have a system of government where the majority gets to, it's like tyranny. The majority gets everything and the minority gets nothing. Well, no. But the system you guys are describing is that the minority is getting everything and the majority doesn't get representation. That's not fair. And by the way our system is set up, the Senate already gets 2 representatives per state. That already favors rural conservative voters, because even though they have a lower population density, they're getting more proportional representation per senator. They already have an advantage in the Senate, right? And then you're taking away, the House of Representatives is supposed to be the check on that by having a chamber of the legislature that is based on population. So that if you have groups of larger population, at least they're getting represented in the House of Representatives. But Republicans, by gerrymandering, are also taking away that. So when they kind of complain that, oh, well, we don't want to get, tyranny of the majority, like we don't get to have any say in our own government. Well, you're doing that to the majority. You're being a hypocrite because you're not even giving the rest of the voters in the country representation. But then you're turning around and pretending like you're doing it to make sure that you guys have representation. In states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Democrats regularly won a majority or near majority of the statewide vote, but were restricted to fewer than a third of the legislative seats. So then there's this whole thing about Thomas Hofeller. Nobody talks about this anymore, but Thomas Hofeller was somebody who was a Republican strategist, gave seminars up and down the country at the state level, at the federal level, was paid by various Republican and conservative leaning organizations. And he was developing like tools to gerrymander, right? After he died, after his death, Hofeller's daughter, Stephanie Hofeller, made available computer hard drives that had been her father's possession. Files on the hard drive showed that he played a key part in decisions of the Trump administration to add, this whole citizenship. I don't really care about the citizenship question. I personally actually agree with Republicans on this point. I don't think it's fair to have non-citizens shift like the apportionment of the Congress. I think that's fair. Right? You shouldn't. It should be the Congress, composition of Congress should be reflective of the population of citizens, right? Yes, we should consider the total population, including immigrants, when we're, approaching certain questions about, funding and allocations and different policy and everything. But the representation, the representatives in Congress should represent the citizenry. Okay, so I don't really care about that one. But we get down to things like, citizenship question. North Carolina, it goes beyond that. And if you read the Wikipedia article, a lot of it's spent on the citizenship question. Not a lot of it is spent on the internal memos from the Hoffler files, emails that they had between him and other Republicans, they were doing things that were explicitly trying to gerrymander and institute voting suppression laws, specifically not, a lot of times Republicans will try to sell it as, oh, we're just trying to make sure our election's secure. No, their internal memos were explicitly saying that they were doing it to try to eliminate as many Democratic voters as possible and to dilute the representation. And they were doing it along racial lines. And yet everybody pretends that this isn't the case. Everybody pretends that the Republicans aren't doing this. We have documentation from their internal memos where they're explicitly talking about it. And yet the media still gives them a pass when they go in the media and say, oh, we're not being racist. We're not doing it for racial reasons, right? We know that you guys have been doing it for that reason. It's literally like you guys have literal documentation of you guys doing that. But nobody calls them out on this. Nobody brings this up. So the North Carolina case is like one of the best cases to point out this behavior. So the New Yorker was first media outlet to obtain at least 70,000 files in several years of emails that were saved by Hoffler. David Daly wrote that the files, quote, mostly pertain to Hoffler's work in North Carolina, where he drew and defended in court the state legislative and congressional maps multiple times after judges ruled them to be either unconstitutionally partisan or racial gerrymanders. On September 3rd, 2019, in the case of Common Law versus Lewis, a North Carolina court struck down the state's legislative maps as a partisan gerrymander in violation of the state's constitution. Mark Joseph Stern wrote in Slate, quote, the court had unprecedented access to the gerrymandering process thanks to the Hoffler files. The court cited from Hoffler's files that metadata on maps of state legislative districts showed they were almost completely drawn months before the Republican legislative leaders publicly adopted the standards for drawing them. The three-judge panel also cited his files, quote, in concluding that he had used racial statistics to shape his maps despite public claims to the contrary. So keep in mind, Republicans were out in public saying, oh, we're not doing that, we're not doing that. Turns out in their internal memos, they were literally doing that. Joey Chen, a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, had testified in July 2019 that he had found that Hoffler had manually entered, quote, %18 underscore app underscore BLK black into nearly every draft of his mapping software that he mapped North Carolina's districts. The formula, so that quote, what he entered here, that's a formula. The formula 18% app black shows the number of African citizens of voting age in each district. Why are they doing that? Because they're trying to find out how many black voters are able to vote in those areas, because they want to target those voters. They want to target black voters. They said this in their emails, by the way. I read this at one period in time. They want to target black voters because the black voters are voting Democratic. Think about what they're doing right now with eliminating these majority black districts in Republican states now. They know that they're targeting people along racial lines because they don't want those people to have representation. They don't want them to vote in ways that they don't like, they don't agree with. They want to control the country. They don't want anyone else in the country to have any say in the country. In November 2019, a court ruled that Hoffler's files were no longer considered confidential as they address political activities in other states affecting redistricting in national census and could be used in other suspected cases of gerrymandering. The files covered Hoffler's work on political maps in Arizona, Florida, Maryland, Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio, Tennessee, Virginia, along with New York and Texas. Do you understand the scope and scale of what Republicans have been up to? This is not recent. This is through the 2010s. Okay? Nobody talks about this. I don't know why they don't talk about this. We all pretend like we don't know that this happened. This happened. And by the way, what was the status of gerrymandering prior to 2024? So prior to Donald Trump taking office, just to give you an idea of how badly they were doing it even before this current round. Okay, look at this map. Zoom in. Look at this map. Okay, this shows partisan lean of gerrymanders. And if you look at this, right, let's look at the number of blue states that are argued to have been gerrymandered. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Not good. There's 50 states. Keep that in mind. How many states are gerrymandered by Republicans? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Also, keep in mind what I said earlier. They were trying to gerrymander other states as well. These are the states that they managed to do. 11-4. But let's not stop there. Let's count what the partisan lean of those gerrymanders netted in terms of seats. 1, 2, 3 plus 2 is 5. 2 plus 5, 7. So Democrats had a 7-point advantage due to gerrymandering prior to 2024. Republicans had 1 plus 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 14, 15, 17, 23, 22, 22, right? I count that right? 22? 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, 12, 13, 15, 16, 18, 23. Either 23 or 25. I might have miscounted at some point there. 7 versus 23. And Republicans have been trying to gerrymander even more. The scope and scale of Republican gerrymandering is massive.
26. Sean, do you acknowledge that?
No, because the Democrats did this in New York. They ended up setting up a nonpartisan gerrymandering commission back in like 2013. It was one of Andrew Cuomo's achievements. And the reason they set it up is because Republicans used to control the New York.
They like to pretend like, oh, Democrats started it. And no, they fucking didn't. No, they didn't. And I guarantee that AJW knows about what I just went over. They're malicious. They're malicious people who want to subjugate the rest of the society.
State Senate for the longest time. Then the progressive wave comes in 2019 and 2021. And when it comes to actually do the nonpartisan gerrymandering, what do? They try to pass a partisan map. A court strikes it down. They set up a map that they use for 2022. Then the Democrats fight against that, and they did redistricting. And they'll say it was slight, but it was all advantageous toward Democratic candidates, even though the judges actually set up one of the most competitive
Notice what he's not
maps
telling
that we
you.
had in the entire
Notice what
country.
he's not talking
They altered
about.
that in 2024 in order to advantage Democrats in response to the changing political landscape that they had. So the idea that this wasn't a thing that was happening, obviously Trump just made it blunt. He said directly he wanted 5 seats, and that set off like this new wave. But the idea that we didn't already have this, and Democrats weren't already better at this, is ridiculous. Massachusetts, for 30 years, will not have a Republican member in the House of Representatives. That's 10, and then eventually, because they lost a seat, 9 seats that will be completely Democrat for 30 straight years after this election cycle. Like, they've been better at.
Notice he hasn't said a single thing about all of the Republican gerrymandering that's been going on for at least the past 20 years. It's just, this is how lying and manipulating the public happens in our current media environment. They are intentionally not giving you full context. They are intentionally leaving out other details.
At this for a very long time.
Okay, Pisco, a response to that.
Yeah, sure, 100%. So listen, we can dispute when to start the track record. It kind of reminds me of like the conversations about the war in Gaza. And people are like, well, do we start at October 7th? Do we stop before that? Like, at a certain point, I will dispute the notion of like who's worse on gerrymandering and when it started. But it's beside the point. Look at what Sean is doing. What Sean is doing is, as part of the questioning and assessing of the normative issue when it comes to partisan gerrymandering, he's considering the conduct of other states. Because of course you consider the conduct of other states.
Good. I'm glad he
an
caught
issue that affects all of us. And yeah, that's in the context of state rules on partisan gerrymandering. That's in the context of state decisions from state Supreme Courts on the same issue. And so, of course, that's proving my point that when it comes to these issues, it's artificial to put up barriers.
We
Like,
can
well,
be
no.
here for a long time.
When it comes to partisan gerrymandering, it's
redundant.
And wanting to escalate in ways that would clearly destroy judicial independence. It is
because we acknowledge that getting everyone retired isn't adding to the number of seats available in the given state in Virginia if that were to be implemented. So there's legislative court packing and there's non-legislative court packing. There's also proposals to impeach, which by the way I don't support, against people like Clarence Thomas.
I don't believe that what Mitch McConnell did in 2017, while I do think it was wrong, is worth destroying the Supreme Court as we know it.
So let me go back.
Would start an escalatory.
There's another thing that they try to make the argument. Basically, they're arguing about like when during Obama's term, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans denied Obama and the Democrats the ability, even though they had the majority using a filibuster, they denied the Democrats' ability to actually appoint their own judges, because this was all part of that whole red map plan. Is the Republicans wanted to take control of the courts so that they could then gerrymander the states legislatures, and then they can basically take control of all three branches of government without having the ability for Democrats to be competitive or have representation of their own. Now, that I think AJW says at some point here, basically like, oh, well, you know, the Republicans, they rammed through all of these Supreme Court justices when Donald Trump was in office. They removed the filibuster in order to ram through these judges, but they were doing that because you guys removed the filibuster on lower level judges to put lower level justices through, right? But what he doesn't tell you, what Republicans will never tell you about this whole argument, is that the reason that Democrats did remove the filibuster on those lower level justice seats was because the Republicans were also blocking them. Even though Democrats have won elections, the Republicans were blocking them from putting any judges into office in an unprecedented fashion, meaning they were leaving seats open longer than, like, historically we leave just judge seats open. It's unprecedented. They were leaving an unprecedented amount of judge positions open because they were piling them up to wait for, like, oh, when we come back into office, when we get the majority, then we're going to appoint all these judges, but we're not going to let you appoint any. So they'll leave that context out, that even in that case, Republicans started it, Democrats responded, like, hey, like, we can't live in a scenario where you guys don't let us have any representation in our government and all of the government institutions are skewed to your side. Like, if you're not going to let us appoint any judges, even though we won a majority in Congress and we won the presidency, then we're going to end the filibuster for these positions because you're using the filibuster to corrupt our government. We're going to end it here so that we can put judges in office. Then Republicans come into office. When they were talking about proportionality, oh, it's an escalation. When the Republicans removed the filibuster on Supreme Court judges, that's an escalation. That's not lower level judges. That's Supreme Court judges. That's the highest court in the entire country. So that was an escalation. That escalation was in response to what they say was a Democrat escalation, but that Democratic escalation was in response to what Republicans did. They don't take accountability for the fact that this whole idea of, like, rush to the bottom tends to be started by Republicans overwhelmingly. And the other thing that Brad doesn't realize, that Brad doesn't want, he wants to avoid a situation where we're just going back and forth trading blows and the country's getting more extreme, more partisan. It's a rush to the bottom, right? Brad doesn't want the Democrats to respond in kind and in escalatory fashion for that reason, right? But what Brad doesn't understand is that that concept of a ratchet, right? That things are getting worse, but they don't go back to being more normal because, like, we're getting more and more extreme. That ratchet effect, you're not going to stop that ratchet effect by only having Democrats stop their behavior. Because as long as Republicans are allowed to keep ratcheting, it's going to keep ratcheting. It has to be. Like, physically, logically, deductively, there's just no way around it. It has to be mutual. It cannot be unilateral. It physically cannot be unilateral. It doesn't matter if Democrats decide that they're not going to respond. It will ratchet anyways because the Republicans will be ratcheting it, and you're training them that there's no consequence for them ratcheting. Why would they stop? They're getting an advantage out of it, and nobody's willing to stop them. So Brad is under the delusion that he can stop this ratchet effect where we're rushing to the bottom if he can convince Democrats to stop responding. But Brad doesn't realize that he's not stopping that process of happening. Brad has to get both the Republicans and the Democrats to both stop.
Spiral of packing, then packing, then packing.
Okay.
That would.
It's just parity on that level, right? Because there's a norm. So I've already talked about proportionality.
That's more of the same. Apparently, this debate, I didn't see this part. Apparently, the debate panel erupts after he brings up old videos. I'm not sure what they're talking about. I kind of want to see that part. So I did listen. When I listened in the car the other day, I got through this part. They talk about like bringing the crime rate down. Pretty much everybody on this panel basically acknowledges that the president doesn't really have much effect over the crime rate. It's more of a local level thing. So there's not much here. To be honest with you, it's better than the conversations people typically have over crime rates when they try to pretend like presidents have control over it. The policy around crime and punishment and policing is at the state level. States are in charge of their own policing. There is federal policing apparatuses, you know, FBI, the FBI, the CIA, and stuff like that. But those, they're very limited. The overwhelming vast majority of policing and criminal justice is happening at state level institutions. But so that's what that is. But I'm not really super interested in that whole thing. Okay, so I guess I didn't get to this part when I was listening on the road the other day. I want to hear this part. Let's see what happens here.
And this clip that I'm going to play and then give you a chance to respond, Sean.
But you talked about prices. I want to talk about that. So if prices don't come down in the next 4 years, are you?
Oh, okay. So they're talking about inflation. The previous segment, they were talking about inflation. Actually, let's get a little bit of context. Hold on.
Huge effect on prices. And it's sticky too. It's not as easy to, like, I don't know, lower prices the way that he's suggesting, the way he promised. And that was always, I think, pie in the sky promise. But ultimately he's doing things to make things worse.
So they're talking about, like, inflation is ticking up now under Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump ran on, you know, I'm going to make everything more affordable. The Democrats are bad and everything. A lot of people don't know. I mean, Democrats left the U.S. inflation low when Biden left office. Everybody blames Biden for inflation during the Biden years. But, like, everybody forgets that COVID was a factor. Inflation was a global phenomenon. There's nothing that the United States could do to avoid that. Because we're tied in with the global market, any global trends are also going to affect us. Inflation was a global aspect of COVID. It's not really Biden's fault. The real question, if you want to be, like, legitimately objective and neutral and fair, the real question is, how did Biden's administration handle that global inflation compared to other countries? And the reality is that the United States handled the inflation better than pretty much every other country on the planet. We came out of the COVID pandemic economically better than every other country on the planet. That's not to say that it was rainbows and unicorns and sunshine. It's just to say that the entire globe was affected by COVID and the effects it had on the economy. It was shitty for everybody, but we managed to be less shitty than everybody because of the way that we handled it. But let's look at an inflation graph over time to kind of make this point to you guys here. I want something that goes to, here we go. Okay. So here's 2020, basically the start of inflation, right? Inflation during this time period, pretty low, right? But COVID is starting to become a thing, right? We call it COVID-19, but you have to understand COVID-19, it was springing up in the later half of 2019. I remember reading about it, I think in October or December, somewhere in that time period. It didn't reach the United States until I think it was March. I could be wrong about that. I think it was until March. So really the effects are starting to be felt in the later into 2020. So we see CPI, the rate of consumer price index inflation. So it starts to trickle up, right? Global impacts from COVID. It reaches a peak in, what is this? The middle of 2022. So 2021, Biden takes over office. The effects of COVID. This is felt in every country, by the way. I'm not making this up. We can look at graphs of that. If you really, I don't want any of you saying that I'm making shit up. Inflation globally, COVID. Look at this. Look at the inflation effects during COVID. The United States was not too bad, all things considered, because you have these other countries where it was really high. But here you go. Here's a chart of what happened. The idea that Biden is responsible for inflation, how do you explain that when you see inflation in every other fucking country? Are we going to pretend that Biden was the president of every other country? Like, come on. Stop being stupid, right? We know that inflation was an aspect of the COVID pandemic. But the important thing is, how did we handle it? And look, peaks up in the middle of 2022. It gets brought back down. And when Biden leaves office, inflation is back down under 4%. So we leave the country with inflation going down. And then Donald Trump instigates the Iran war, which is probably one of the stupidest wars in human history, just to be honest with you. I have a video on that. I don't want to belabor that point again. And so the current inflation that's now ticking up, by the way, job growth has also been declining. Wage growth is stagnant. Our economic numbers aren't looking great. I mean, the stock market is increasing. You got all this insider trading. That's great for all the rich people, but the wages are stagnant. Inflation is going up. Gas prices are going up. But none of this is because of COVID. None of this is because of like a natural disaster or a pandemic we have no control over. It's because Donald Trump decided to launch one of the stupidest wars in human history. 2025, 2026. Where are we at? This is perspective. Actually, let's. I don't know. I don't know when the time windows on some of these are. Let's look at what do we have. I don't even know if I could trust the freaking Fred anymore. I don't know if I could trust the Bureau of Labor Statistics. All items less food and energy. Okay. So inflation's going up now. What is this? 2020. Okay. So between April of last year and April of this year. Look at, he inherited inflation that was pretty low, 3%. And then it was continuing to go down, and then he decides to launch a stupid fucking war, and look, now we're going back up again. Isn't that awesome?
I think the Federal Reserve is less likely now to do interest rate cuts, and yeah, it's a
which means Americans borrow more, pay more for their homes, pay more for all sorts of things. Which, listen, it's a real mess. I agree with you that he obviously does care about it. Why else would he be pushing for a federal gas tax holiday, right? Which at most I think would take 10 or 15 cents off the price. It's like a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, and it is funny to me to see many.
My understanding too is that we're not even feeling the full effects of the energy crisis that is to come. My understanding is that part of it is because we have a lot of energy production in the United States, but understand that we're not insulated from those effects, because even though we have some energy independence here in the United States, we get a lot of our trade from other countries. Those other countries are actually being, I've heard from like European countries, they're actually being like, it's making a big impact, the price of gas in those other countries. That's going to start hitting us in our wallets here in the United States. I mean, we're already feeling it here in the gas prices here are higher, but it's also going to be all the consumer goods and services that are reliant upon transportation, upon, for example, petroleum products are oil-based, plastics are oil-based. The prices of all these things are going to increase too. And it's going to keep rising before it falls back down again. I don't think we've reached the peak yet.
Any Republicans who explicitly, like, I want lower taxes in general, and I don't have super strong feelings about the gas tax one way or the other or holiday, but it is funny how many Republican senators were on the record absolutely hard against a federal gas tax holiday under Biden, who are now literally like championing it now that it's Trump.
Or spending, by the way. Overall, people will attribute the inflation, which I totally...
Government spending right now is crazy. Every time Republican comes into office, deficit. I saw a nice infographic the other day that was animated that shows like the net effect of, let's see, I saw it on Reddit. These are nice too, but there was a cool animated one I saw the other day. Oh, it's this one. This is debt growth. So deficit, if you don't really understand, deficit is the difference between your revenue versus expenditures for the year. If you have a deficit, it's basically the debt for that year. Debt, however, is the total debt for like the entire history of the United States. So the way you reduce the debt is by reducing the deficit year over year. The way you increase the debt is by every year spending more than you're actually taking in. So look at this animation real fast. Okay, so the blue line is Democrats, the red line is Republicans, and the higher up on the graph you go, the more debt that's being added. The lower on the graph you go, you're reducing the deficit, right? It's still positive, so zero's down here. Or I'm sorry, this is -1. The graph is going to start, the scale is going to start increasing, right? If the scale right here is negative, this means reduction. If you're going downward, it's a reduction in the debt. If you're going up on the scale, you're now increasing the debt, right? So pay attention to the blue and red line. The blue is what Democrats are responsible for. The red is what Republicans are responsible for. The blue line is going to show like there's going to be some decreases, but there's going to be some increases. You can't go from a deficit that's handed over to you from a Republican Party and then reduce it to zero overnight. The best you could do is start to like reduce it year over year. And in fact, this is something that happened during the Obama administration. The deficit and the debt was really high when he inherited the economy from George Bush. We're in a recession. He did a little bit of spending, stimulus spending, but afterwards you saw year over year through the 8 years of Obama's presidency. I think maybe the first 2 years might have been increases, and then every year after that it was deficit decreases. And if you just kept following that trend, if you didn't vote for another Republican, if you just kept following that trend, we would have eventually reduced our deficit down to zero and then started paying things down, started having a surplus, right? But pay attention to the growth on this graph. Reductions. We're in negative territory. Increase. All Republican. Increase. Okay, now Democrats in office. Decrease. Republican office. Increase. Democrat gets in office. Increase. Donald Trump. Increase. Right? Look at the total cumulative effect. Look at how huge of a difference there is between how much debt and deficit Republicans have been adding versus Democrats. And yet the public in the United States thinks it's the other way around. Why do they think that? Have they looked at any of the statistics? No, they haven't. They think that because the media keeps telling them that. Because Republicans, as a talking point, just keep repeating that, oh, we want to reduce deficits and we want to be responsible. We want to cut spending. It's the Democrats. Anybody could say a thing. Anybody can make a claim. Whether it's true or not is a different story.
Discount this kind of the inflation under Biden, that it was a result of federal spending. But okay, if you're going to say that, they passed a big beautiful bill. It's like a record spending package. So if you want to talk about the effect of government spending and on prices, everything is reversed. And so the American people don't trust this administration on prices because they're bad for prices. The administration is doing bad things to the American people, and I think it's obvious, and that's why the polling is what it is.
So the largest, if you look at the charts that you had sent us in the in the lead up to this, the largest indicator of inflation, where it ended up going up to 3.8%, which wipes out the 3.6% in wage growth, is recently, and that is attributable to the price of fuel, which impacts each and every other price. You're trying to smuggle in, oh no, we can't have immigration policy because inflation and all these other things to cram your policy agenda there. And yeah, obviously Trump does care about the impact on the economy. My point wasn't that he isn't lying there, or that he actually doesn't care. My point is that he can't say that. He can't say when he's going to negotiate with Iran that he's in a crap position because
he didn't have to say what he said in that clip either. He could have said, I'm always fighting for Americans, but we've also got to stop the Iranian regime.
But he was saying he's saying it doesn't come into his mind when he's negotiating related to Iran, which is what he should say. But Trump should say it in better words. But he's Trump. He never chooses the best words. It never happens.
So all I'm trying to say there, and I take your point that don't give away your negotiating position, is to the extent that there's a genuine national security trade-off, that is to say that Iran really needs to be prevented by having from having a nuclear weapon. I think most people are saying with respect to the aims of the American negotiators of zero enrichment, which I think is a crazy pie in the sky aim, that the only way to effectuate that is with boots on the ground or escalations in military. So all I'm trying to say is that trade-off, the substantive trade-off, is not one that he's going to take. He's not actually going to waive national security over prices in that context, such that he will go the full distance on the Iran war. Now, I agree, he can't come out in there and say, listen, this is where my breaking points are. But he's given a lot of, listen, I'm not saying that the Trump policies act on prices, as do the Iran war and the fuel price increases
on immigration,
and as does tariffs.
Do you dispute that, Sean?
I don't think it's a major impact because he's been doing the enforcement against illegal immigration in his administration, and wages were up above inflation prior to this. The big shock is the fuel-related shock and all the downstream downstream impacts from that. So if it's immigration, it's marginal, completely overstated, and again, as a way to smuggle in other parts of the agenda to go after what really is a recent shock related to the consequences of the Iran war fallout.
All right, and so you guys previously debated about this subject. Pisco sent me in this clip that I'm going to play and then give you a chance to respond, Sean.
But you talked about prices. I want to talk about that. So if prices don't come down in the next 4 years, are you going to call the policies of Donald Trump with respect to the economy a disaster?
Yeah, of course.
If they don't come down, do you expect the prices to come down?
He said it, and I guarantee flip-flop on that now. He's not going to call it a disaster now, even though he said a few months back. And this is the thing about these grifters online, is they're not accountable to their words and the lies that they sell the American people.
Promised that prices would drop, and he said he was going to do things to help prices drop. So yeah, if prices
is up.
But it's February.
Yeah, what I'm telling you is,
Are you still using statistics from January?
No,
Like, you know how they use
I
the
just-
egg
I just wanna
stat
be
that was
clear.
like the price of eggs as of January 15th?
I want to be clear.
And they blame
so
Trump?
I just want to be clear.
Look at how smug he is over it too. What a fucking grifter.
You should not expect your prices to decrease. You should not expect your price to decrease. So we'll see you again in 2 years.
AJW during this time period. Oh, well, it's just February, guys. Like, there's nothing to worry about, nothing to see here, guys. Pisco's just hyperventilating. He's just liberal. He's just mounting down. He's just, so offended. He's just so in his feelings. Turns out, Pisco was right. AJW was wrong. And AGW is probably not going to take accountability for it. Let's see.
When prices have not decreased, and where Trump, by example, is talking about and edging for these massive tariff wars. You guys saw that, right? Where he's having these fake propaganda victories where nothing of any consequence happens. And so you should not expect those prices to come down. So I'm very, very looking forward to when you post that video in 2 years saying Trump's policies are a disaster because prices have not come down.
I think you can expect some of your energy prices to come down, and that will have some downstream effects on the economy.
Oh, really?
So, Pisco, I guess what I'm wondering is what are you looking for by bringing up this clip?
Well, I just tweeted out because I think it's incumbent on Sean to describe Trump's economic record here as a disaster. I think that, okay, 4 years haven't elapsed yet, but we're a significant way into this administration. There doesn't seem to be any sign that prices are going to come down. Inflation is up from where Biden left it. We're at what, 3.8? Was that the number out of the Labor Department today? So yeah, like where is the sign that prices are going to come down? And when do we get the mea culpa to say actually Trump was bad on prices?
Okay,
and, quote,
Sean?
a disaster.
Sean, your
So
response.
first of all, I clearly and obviously get another year because Pisco put out a 2-year timeline. Secondly, the Iran war prior to it, and you could check this for yourself. And in fact, I sent you a chart, Brad,
I
in
can
an
pull that
email
up in post.
after Pisco had indicated that he wanted to sneak this in here for a cheap victory. But I sent him a chart about how gas prices actually fell prior to the Iran war to the lowest level since 2021. And specifically in that clip, what did I say? You can expect your energy prices to come down due to energy policy. Now, of course, we have a shock in the oil prices. Depending on how this conflict resolves, we are going to see the downstream impacts of that. And if it doesn't go well and Trump ends up blowing it or not completing the mission or leaving some deal where Iran
He just shifts the goalpost, right? Like, okay, it's going up now due to the Iran war, but hey, you know what? Maybe it'll resolve. Hey, in the future, if it still doesn't, if he doesn't do good in the future, I swear, next time I'll call it out, okay? But like, oh, this time, like, you got to give him a little bit of leeway. There's a good explanation. Next time, I swear, next time I'll call him out for sure.
and has significant control of the Strait of Hormuz, or like we have traffic delayed in the Strait of Hormuz going forward, then yeah, in a year, which is my timetable given to me by Pisco, that would be an absolute failure. Again, that's the issue at hand. But yeah, energy prices absolutely.
How much do we want to bet that he, if and when that does happen, will he actually admit that it's failure, or will he come up with another excuse why? Well, actually, Donald Trump actually had a good reason this time, and
Did come down. I was 100% right all the way leading up to March of this year. And now you want to take this little snapshot right now at this moment, sneak that in here so you could get yourself a little victory. And I just want people to actually go to that debate, by the way, and go listen to how I discussed inflation and what parts I attributed to Biden, what parts I attributed to COVID, and how reasonable and wonderful I was in that discussion. And look at this guy right here who's bringing up the price of eggs. That debate was on February 17th, by the way, of
okay, apparently the debate panel erupts. I want to see it erupt.
2021. So it was like less.
I'm sorry, we don't live in the counterfactual where the Iran war didn't have lagging indicators in terms of the over.
Number two, yes, he did launch the Iran 50% enriched uranium.
Oh boy.
If he doesn't get a handle over this. So yeah, absolutely, he is responsible for this 100%. I do want to point out that I did predict a good energy policy, cheaper in the economy, not good. So once it's launched, I want the United States of America to win. Like, I know it's like trendy online, even in the right tax, because we don't ever.
In response in a retaliatory fashion. And well, sorry.
Oh, okay. Let's get into
The authority to
this.
do
I
that.
love this.
Once we're in, well, first of all, nobody declares war anymore. So yeah, in that regard, I actually hate the.
Okay, this is a lie by Republicans. Nobody declares war. There's a weird technicality
actual
here.
launch of these.
It's almost like it's technically true, right? Congress doesn't declare war, and I think that they should be declaring war. However, what people don't really understand is that under the whole point of giving Congress the authority to declare war is the founders of the Constitution wanted that decision to be made by a deliberative body. When I say deliberative body, I mean there are people that are coming together to deliberate the decision, right? Should we do this? Should we not do this? What's your opinion on it? What's your perspective? I give my perspective. Somebody else who represents a different interest, a different part of the country, different experience from mine says, hey, you know what? I heard you say what you said, but I think you need to consider X, Y, and Z thing. Let's deliberate all about all this before we decide to commit the United States to war one of the most extreme things that we could do from a policy perspective. We're not deciding whether or not we want to pass a policy on whether we should, whether chocolate chip cookie dough is the best ice cream flavor. This is war that we're talking about. The founders deliberately and specifically did not give that authority to the president. I know people think when they hear commander-in-chief, they think that means the president has full control over the military. Control over the military is split between the legislative and executive branch. As commander-in-chief, the president has like day-to-day, on-the-ground, minutia authority over the military. But the decision to actually use the military to go to war is Congress's, and the ability to actually fund those military operations is for Congress. It's split authority. It's a check and balance there. Although Congress did not declare war in Iraq and Afghanistan, what it did give, because again, the whole purpose of giving that power to Congress is that Congress makes the decision whether or not we get involved in military operations. Congress still voted to give Barack Obama and George Bush a AUMF, authorization for use of military force. It's essentially the same thing, but by a different name. It's not a literal, it's not, technically a declaration of war, but it's essentially the same thing. So Congress did, like Barack Obama and Bush, they weren't able to wage those wars unilaterally with no check and balance without having to get permission from Congress. Congress gave them permission to do so. And those AUMFs, there's a whole thing about why they did AUMF versus declaration of war related to like terrorist categorization, whatever. It's a topic for a different day. That AUMF extended to not just a war with Iraq and Afghanistan, was a war against these terrorist organizations. So if those terrorist organizations spread to other countries, which they did, right? If we were involved in Syria, for example, it was covered under the AUMF because the AUMF was actually a declaration, basically a declaration of war against these terrorist organizations, which were multilateral non-state actors. When you say non-state actors, it means it's not a country, it's not a legitimate government. These are like terrorist groups who aren't an actual government or country, and sometimes they don't obey boundaries and borders and stuff like that, right? So that's the difference. And so every time these people will bring up like, oh, well, Donald Trump didn't have a declaration from Congress, but nobody does that anymore. Bush and Obama did the same thing. No, they didn't. They had authorization from Congress. Donald Trump had none of those things. Another thing they'll bring up is the War Powers Resolution, which was passed by Congress to give, again, Congress gives the authority to the president, as they're supposed to, gave the authority to the president to engage in military operations, not a full-on war, a military operation, in the event of an imminent threat. And the thought process there was in the event of an imminent threat. And this came about during, I think, the World War II, Cold War era. The idea is now we're facing military threats where people can launch and attack us within the span of a few hours. Unlike back in the day when the founding fathers passed the Constitution, it took days or months in order to get people's boats all the way from over here to actually invade us. It wasn't the same nature of, war. They say war never changes. It absolutely does. So Congress decided, hey, in an era where we have like bombers and jet fighters and they can launch intercontinental ballistic missiles and they have nuclear war, we need to have the ability to have the president respond immediately without having to get tied up in Congress and everything. We decided to give him that power, whether you agree or disagree with that decision. Because I think that there's a lot of arguments on, maybe that's giving the president a little bit too much power. Nevertheless, that War Powers Resolution exists, but it exists for imminent threats only. In the Donald Trump administration, members of his administration have already admitted that there was no imminent threat. In addition to that, you're supposed to notify Congress. They didn't notify Congress. And it's supposed to only last for 60 days. We're beyond the 60-day time window now.
These attacks because we don't ever follow the proper congressional procedures. But again, once we're in it, I'm here to...
And by the way, how is that even an excuse? Oh, well, you know, we don't follow the procedures, so whatever. Like, we're just all not going to follow the procedures. Well, maybe you should follow the procedures. Maybe that's not a good argument. Maybe the argument that, oh, well, nobody follows the rules, so we can just shred up the rules now, and we're not going to try to follow the rules now. Maybe that's a way that you degrade your country and your constitution.
See it through to the end, and I'm hoping for the best outcome for America.
But you got a big, cheesy fucking smile on your face, so I guess it's okay, right? It's all just a stupid fucking game to you.
That sounds like you support it. That sounds like you want America to go in all out, and you don't really care that it's illegal just because everyone has done it in a legal fashion. And so why should I listen to you on like norms when it comes to, you know, race to the bottom and anything?
True and absolutely based. This needs to be bring up more often than we do. Like anytime Republicans make an argument where they're relying on like good faith or something, we should always treat them with like, you guys have lied so much and make excuses for so many lies about Donald Trump. Like every single thing that comes out of your mouth, I'm going to treat like it is reasonable for the general public to treat it as if it's a lie until you prove otherwise. You are not trustworthy. We don't have to pretend that we haven't seen you guys shit all over the fucking floor, you know, earlier in the past couple days. We don't trust you. We have no reason to trust you. And furthermore, you don't have any place to talk about norm violations and the rule of law and the Constitution when you are like in support of illegal, unconstitutional activity. You have no place to stand on that. And we should not be shy about saying that. I don't know why people don't say that more often.
This is the Constitution.
Well, this isn't normal.
No,
like, we just bomb countries
following
on presidential orders.
Surely following the Constitution is more important than norms that are legal to violate.
Yes, I would love for us to go back to congressional war powers, but like that's not where we've been in the United States of America for a while. And it's to such an extent that this is quite literally the norm now. Like they just decide to bomb a country and like it is what it is.
So I'm a fascist because I want to increase the Supreme Court, the size of it in response in a retaliatory fashion. And well, sorry, that was, to be fair to you, Brad in the intro clip said something like, are you allowed to be a fascist in response to fascism or something like that? But so I'm someone who is like fundamentally against the rule of law. It's another term of Brad.
This is a really good point, Brad. I'm glad he brought this full circle.
Advocating for something that's allowed under the Constitution, allowed under the rules, and it's in retaliation to another norm violation. But you're not against the rule of law when you're conceitedly supporting an action that is against the Constitution.
No, because, well, first of all, you're actually separating out the Constitution and norms. The norms are so different from the Constitution in this arena. Presidential power to move and utilize military assets has
Which is more important, the norms or the Constitution?
So I ideally want the Constitution to be more important. I would love for every president to be restrained. But the idea that, like, I'm going to look at this right now, we're already in it, and I don't want the U.S. to get the best possible outcome because Congress didn't declare this war in the way that they should. And again, in an abstract, intellectual way, I would agree with you. But, like, we're in it right now, and I want America to get the best outcome.
Pisco,
like, the practical side of
Obama?
me.
Here's the other thing that Democrats and liberals need to start making the argument for. If Republicans have decided that the rule of law and the Constitution is no longer a boundary and they're able to do it, why should we ever listen to you anytime that you ever say that we're being unfair to you? Or, hey, let's say, you know what? We think the Trump administration and Republicans have been involved in an attempt to coup our government and violating our rights and responsibilities and everything. You know, we don't actually have to cite anything. You guys decided that the Constitution and the rule of law doesn't matter anymore, doesn't count, we don't have to follow it. Then we should be able to just go after you guys and do whatever the fuck that we want to do to you guys. Why not? If you're going to do it, we're going to do it. I don't have to follow let's look at the Virginia Supreme Court decision. I don't have to follow it. You guys are telling me that you guys violating the law and the Constitution, like you're okay with doing that. So, hey, you know what? If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. I don't have to give a justification. I don't have to follow the rules or the law or the Constitution or your courts. I can do whatever the fuck I want now. And when we get into office, we can just round you guys up and do whatever the fuck we want with you guys now because you guys decided that the rules and the boundaries don't matter anymore. But they feel comfortable doing this and saying this kind of behavior because they actually, you know, it's that famous quote. What is it? To bind but not protect or something? Not project, protect. Conservatism consists of exactly one proposition. There must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind. So in other words, their group, the conservatives, the Republicans, the law exists to protect them in their mind, but it doesn't constrain them. They don't have to follow the law. Alongside outgroups, so everybody else whom the law binds, so everybody else has to follow the law, but the law doesn't protect them. Conservatism consists of exactly one proposition. There must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. I believe... Well, no, I won't go there. Okay, we'll continue.
Was
on.
Obama fundamentally at odds with the rule of law then?
Yes. When he intervened with respect to Libya, that was against the Constitution.
That's what I'm referring to,
Yeah.
I wouldn't grant this because I don't even think it's true. I believe the AUMF covered Libya, because I think Libya, in the Libya case, I know that's not how you spell it, Libya. The 2001 authorization for use of military force was not originally intended for operations alone. It doesn't matter if it was intended, what did the word say? But successive executive, see, this would be a norm violation, not a actual law violation. But successive executive had broadly interpreted to cover counterterrorism strikes against associated force operating in that country. Yeah, see, that's the thing, because the AUMF did not refer to like a specific country. It referred to terrorist organizations that were operating internationally. So even if you think that, hey, what Obama did when he extended military operations into Libya was a norm violation, was something, I don't really like it. Technically, the AUMF did give him authority to do so. I wouldn't grant this argument.
100%. No,
it's not comparable to what Donald Trump's doing right now.
I grant that, and that is just clear and evident on an originalist interpretation of what the Constitution means. But
Are you an
the problem here
originalist?
is everyone's an originalist now, Brad. Everyone's an originalist now. But just to make it clear for people, it's more important to follow the Constitution. So I don't want to hear about rule of law and some kind of like, I don't know, hand-wringing about the judiciary when Sean is conceitedly in favor of an action which he concedes violates the Constitution, which is worse.
Well, wait, Pisco, are you so from Sean's framework, are you cheering for the U.S. to win or lose the war?
So I always want U.S. to win, but
they ran the same playbook in 2001. If you're too young to remember, you're too young to have witnessed what happened in the lead up to the Iran and Afghanistan war, you might ask yourself sometimes, like, how did our country, how are we so stupid to get ourselves involved in that conflict? Nobody had the idea to like pull us back from that. Well, they did. But at that time period, anybody, I was alive for this. I remember this. This is like visceral. I remember this on Fox News, on other programs. Anybody at that time period who questioned the Bush administration trying to get us in the Iran and Afghanistan war, anytime they tried to do that, they flipped it around to say, oh, so you don't support the troops? You don't support the United States? You want the U.S. to lose? They did the exact same thing during that time period. And a lot of these people have learned fucking nothing from that time period.
But I thought he said that he wants the war to continue.
Sean?
No, well, I mean, I prefer for an end, but an end that's positive for the United States of America. Like once
Well,
we're in
everyone
it,
can
I
agree
want
with
the
that,
best possible.
but the war
once
needs
we're
to
in
stop
it, I want the
because-
best. Once we're in it, I want the best possible outcome. And right now, if stopping this, like right in this moment, leaves us in a terrible position with the Iranians controlling the strait, no, I'm not in favor of stopping it. On
Even
a
if the
practical level.
Constitution,
Constitutionally,
even
I
if the
agree with
Constitution
you. They
needs to be
should have
violated.
declared it and all of that. But like in the Libya situation, when Obama started like the no-fly zone in Libya, which by the way is less extreme compared to what we're dealing with right here, that was unconstitutional, but. Like, once you're doing it, you root for the best possible outcome because in the practical reality of this country going back decades, we don't declare war. We haven't declared a war.
I don't know if I agree with this. I don't know if I agree that AUMFs are unconstitutional. What is the opinion on are AUMFs unconstitutional? Whether authorizations of use of military force are unconstitutional is a subject of ongoing legal and political debate, but because we're treating in this debate as if everybody just ipso facto agrees that that's the case. I don't think so. I think that like when Article 1 grants Congress the sole power to declare war, I think when they grant an AUMF, they're essentially doing the same thing. It's just called something different. But I think in the spirit and in the principle, I don't think it's really different. I don't know if I agree that this is unconstitutional. But they have not been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The argument centers on the balance of powers. Opponents, including some legal scholars, argue that the broad AUMF violate the Constitution for a few key reasons. Abdication of duty. Critics argue that passing a broad, open-ended AUMF. So, I mean, I would agree if it's overbroad and too open-ended, but that would also be true if they did a declaration of war that was overbroad and open-ended, right? I don't think that's unique. Effectively hands Congress war declaring power over to the executive branch, but it also doesn't really declare it because Congress has to approve that authorization, right? Unlike formal declarations of war, AUMFs often lack geographical limits, timelines, or specific. But I don't think there's anything in the Constitution that says declarations of wars have to have all of these limitations. I agree, by the way, that they should be more specific about what the extent of the authorization is. But I don't think that this is functionally different from what the Constitution like permits or requires. I don't think so. Constitution. Declaration of war. What does it actually say? Let's read. Is this the actual wording? Every time I go on the site, I don't know if they're actually giving me the wording or if they're summarizing. I want to say that they're summarizing. I want to know what the actual wording is. Yeah, see, they're summarizing. They're not giving me what the actual... I want to know what the actual wording is. I don't even know. Is there a way to look that up on the site? Or that they don't even give us the ability to read it? I think that this is it. I think all the rest here are like conversations about how people interpret this over time and the history around it. But I think that this is actually literally fucking it. To declare war, grant... I think this is all it says. So like all this other stuff about like having to have a timetable and everything, the Constitution actually doesn't say that. I agree we should. Maybe we should amend the Constitution to add those things. That's a conversation worth having. But to say that the AMFs are functionally different, like no, even a declaration of war isn't required to have those things either. I mean, maybe there's statutory law that modifies that, but I don't know. I don't want to dive into this right now.
Since World War II.
Or statutory authorization. I'm not saying that needs to be a formal declaration of war. It needs to be Congress who does the action.
Yes, thank you.
The key point here is
Pisco.
You're in favor of continuing an action for practical purposes that you know to violate the Constitution. In other words, continuing the war is a constitutional violation. It offends the separation of powers. And that's basically what's happening here. So you're crying about the judiciary, the powers of the judiciary being ripped to them for things that the legislature is allowed to do. But you're ripping power from Congress and you're okay with it because of the practical consequences.
Okay, let Sean respond.
The Congress should authorize it or not authorize it. I do agree with that. But again, you're trying to pretend...
This weasel mealy mouth bullshit. Oh, you know, I don't agree with it. They should do it this way. Yeah, but you're still in support of it anyways. It doesn't matter. Like you like everything before the but in that sentence is what's the phrase from Game of Thrones? I forgot what he said. Like everything before the but it doesn't matter. It's not what you really mean. Everything after the but. So, oh, you know, they should and ideally, but I still support it anyways. Well, then it's meaningless to you. You don't actually, this isn't a principle that you actually stand behind.
In that context of Virginia, where they're clearly violating a norm in Virginia by getting rid of all...
Oh, well, they're violating a norm. So bad. Bro, you're violating the Constitution. Norm violations, to be clear, if people don't really understand in a U.S. context, norms are suggestions. I'm not being facetious. They're suggestions. That's it. They're ways that we typically do things. They're ways that we expect things to be done. They're expectations we have on each other to be fair with each other. But there is no actual law or constitution stipulation that's saying that this is actually the rule. But that's also part of the problem, is that there's a lot of norms that have been violated during the Trump administration that there's no recourse for because there's no actual law saying that he can't do X, Y, and Z. Some of these norms that have been violated over time are things that probably should be added into law or added into the Constitution through the amendment process. But when AJW is trying to oh, well, you guys are violating norms. Motherfucker, you're violating the actual law, the actual Constitution. Norms were never legally binding. You're violating things that are supposed to be legally binding.
All their Supreme Court justices over a ruling they didn't like is equivalent to what is...
They're not actually doing it.
If they did it, obviously. But to something that is quite literally...
I mean, even right here, what is the logic here? Oh, well, the norm is that you're doing things that are unfair because you don't like the ruling. Motherfucker, you guys are violating the law because you don't like the ruling of the law. What do you think is worse? Violating... it's not a matter of worse here. The point I'm trying to make is the hypocrisy. He's trying to frame it as, oh, well, your guys' norm violation is bad because you guys don't like the rulings, so you're trying to circumvent the rulings, even though you have the legal authority to change the court to do that. But what he's defending, in contrast, is actually violating the law because he doesn't like the rulings of the law.
literally standard fare for decades in this country, which is presidential war-making power, which again, the Congress, I'm original intent guy. Everybody's on that bandwagon. I agree. 2/3 majority of both houses to declare war. That's where I'm at ideally. But once we're in it, yeah, I live in the practical reality. I'm sorry.
Seems like separation of powers only matters when it's convenient. Yeah, I do call it unprincipled. I think that if you're here advocating, I concede that it's a norm violation in the context of the Virginia
It's not a norm
situation.
violation.
All right, well, you get the idea. I want to wrap up this stream by talking about Trump's trip to China. I saw a lot of headlines talking about, China saying the U.S. is a declining power. That's not actually what China said. China declining U.S. power. Just to be fair, because I have no need to lie about the right and Republicans and everything. They do enough bad stuff on their own, as we've covered in this stream already, to not have to make shit up. And I think every time that we do, we create distractions where people are going to start nitpicking. Well, you lied about this. You exaggerated this. The quote that Z made, what President Z said was that China is rising. He didn't say that the U.S. was declining. I mean, I think he probably thinks that. I think the U.S. is declining. And it's not because we had to decline. We're declining because of decisions made by Republicans. The decision at the tail end of Obama's administration to not do the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, how different would the world be as a result of this? The Trans-Pacific Partnership would have been a deal between the United States and all of these Asian countries, and also some of these South American countries, to create an economic bloc where everybody in that economic bloc, they have to obey each other's intellectual property, so their patents and whatnot. They had to, these countries would have to increase their labor standards so that they couldn't undercut us. You have all these people complain about, the United States is getting taken advantage of because these multinational corporations, they take away our jobs and they send them overseas to countries that don't have the same standards we do. Okay, well, the TPP was supposed to remedy that. Not 100% because we don't have the entire world, but it was a step in that direction. But also to counter the influence of China, because these are Asian countries surrounding China that would be forming an economic bloc with the United States. But we decided not to do that. Republican policy. And now Republicans are worried that China is going to eclipse us economically and that the influence of China is expanding now. Other countries are now looking to China as the more stable and reasonable partner. Why would they not? Be objective about this. China's not invading. I mean, they may invade Taiwan, but China's not threatening to invade its allies. The United States is threatening to invade fucking Greenland and Canada. China's not doing that. The United States is creating stupid wars with Iran that are driving an energy crisis for the rest of the fucking world. China's not doing that. The United States is electing people like Donald Trump, who has neo-Nazis during the inauguration, fucking Sieg Heiling, and we all pretend that this is just like normal and shit. Like this didn't fucking happen. We had a neo-Nazi Sieg Heil at our inauguration, and we're all standing around pretending this didn't happen. The Republican Party declared itself in alignment with neo-Nazism. Officially. And we're all pretending this didn't happen. Oh, he was waving to the crowd. Oh, I put my heart out to you. No, this is a Sieg Heil. This is the same guy who's on Twitter reposting neo-Nazis on Twitter. Stop pretending you're stupid. We all know what this is. And they all sat there and let it happen and then put this person in charge of a government organization. China's not doing that. So, anyways, China said in his quote that China's rising. And basically what he was saying is he doesn't want a situation where a rising power, he made an analogy to in ancient Greece, the Athenians were a rising power and the Spartans were kind of looking like that as a threat. And so these two groups kind of, I don't know if they went to war with each other or what happened. Did Athens and Sparta fight? Yes. So they fought wars for domination. So China was saying, hey, we're a rising power. Instead of what happened between the Athenians and the Spartans, where the Spartans saw the Athenians rising and then it led to war and conflict, China was saying, hey, we're rising. We're starting to kind of meet parity, started to be another power in the world that rivals the United States. Instead of warring like the Athenians and the Spartans did, we would rather work together, right? This is also I don't even know if that's like actually what they actually believe behind the scenes, but it doesn't matter because on the international stage, it makes China look like a reasonable, rational, fucking, responsible power that the rest of the world is going to try to start going to now because the United States is acting like an insane, crazy fucking person. That's like causing energy crisis across the world, and it's threatening to invade its own allies. So that's basically what I wanted to say about this. And now you have, like, one of the major reasons the United States is a global military superpower that I don't think Republicans realize this. Like, they try to present themselves as like the military people that understand military and they're cool and they play Call of Duty and shit. They don't, it seems like they don't understand that the United States, U.S. military bases abroad. One of the reasons that we are the dominant military superpower in the world is because we operate all of these military bases overseas. Oh shit, I don't want to do that. It's not just that the United States has the most advanced military equipment or that we have the most experienced and well-trained military personnel. It's that because all of those things don't matter, right? Let's say like in Ukraine is all the way the fuck over here. If we wanted to support Ukraine or if Russia started to invade NATO, what does it matter if we have the most powerful military if we're way over here? What matters, I mean, both of those things matter, but part of the reason, one of the major, like primary reasons that we're a globally military superpower is that we have military force projection power all over the goddamn planet. In Asia, in Africa, in Europe, conspicuously, there's nothing in Russia here, obviously. In North America, in South America, we're everywhere. I don't think there's any other country in the world. Like, let's see, what is the next power? China, military, foreign bases. You never even hear about them. They probably barely exist, if they even exist. What does China have? China's overseas military footprint. It's like, it's nothing. It's nothing. This is like the next strongest power, and they got fucking nothing in terms of force projection power. Now, this might be old. What year was this published? I don't know. They might have expanded since then. All right, what about Russia? Russia, foreign military bases. Base SSS. Okay, what does Russia got? Barely anything. Okay, do you understand what a game changer this is? But because we're now threatening our own allies, why are they going to want to have military bases in their country? That's fucking insane. We're a threat to them now. Why would they host us? So multiple countries now that we're supposed to be allies with that have military bases in them, they're not letting us conduct operations in those bases anymore. And they're also, a lot of them are now talking about not having us operate military bases in their countries anymore. Republicans do all this crazy dumb fucking shit because they're always talking about like this paranoia over the safety and security of the United States. And meanwhile, does that make the United States more safe and secure when we are going to lose our military force projection power? Multiple military bases in the Middle East because of the Iran war now don't have, they've pulled out. They don't want us operating military bases there anymore. All that stupid blood and money that was wasted in the Middle East to establish these things. And then we're blowing it up. So China is a rising power, but all of this is self-inflicted. The United States has more GDP per capita than China. It's not even close. Our GDP is still larger than China. They haven't eclipsed us there yet. Our military power is more advanced. We have more of it than China has. We have more force projection power than China. Our cultural dominance is unmatched by any country in the history of mankind. There's no reason why we should be a declining power while China surpasses us. All of it is self-inflicted because we're making stupid decisions and putting stupid people in charge. This isn't complicated. I don't need to, give like a super elaborate and fancy way of saying this. It's just the cold, hard, brutal simplicity of the fact that Republicans, their politicians, and their policy is fucking stupid. It's retarded. Okay? I know you guys don't like that word. I don't like that word either, but sometimes you need to just communicate the severity of how fucking stupid it is. It's not just that I disagree. It's not just that I disagree. Like, it's actually stupid. It's fucking stupid. Right? I know I'm getting like a little bit unhinged there for a moment there, but like I want to convey to you guys the passion behind like how I feel about it, and like the scope and scale of how bad it is. It is fucking stupid. Republican voters, what they've been supporting, what they've done to this country, it's stupid, but also it's absolutely unfucking forgivable as an American to reduce our security nationally, to destroy our alliances with other countries. I mean, it's not fully destroyed yet, but holy shit. Holy fucking shit. I don't know if we're going to have stable alliances heading into what the United States seems to be trying to do, is instigate fucking World War III, and then we're going to be on the back foot because our allies don't fucking trust us. Inflation's going up. Jobs are stagnating. This country is ready to fucking tear itself apart. We're going to be living under a one-party dictatorship. What Republicans and their voters, every single one of you that voted for this, what you've done to this country is absolutely unforgivable. All I'm saying is everybody that's been involved, the absolute most brutal, ruthless, fullest extent of the law. And you know what? AJW said that we don't have to follow the Constitution anymore either. So, you know, absolute immunity. Constitution doesn't really matter as a boundary anymore. What these people have done to our country is absolutely unforgivable. All right. And with that, I end my stream. You know, if you like my stuff, like, share, and subscribe. Do all that good stuff. I know I've been promising a stream for a while now about like this, you know, it's yours if you could just take it or whatever. Basically, I want to put forth a policy platform for the Democratic Party for the next, like, I don't know, 10 years or more. Like something where we're not all just like a bunch of chickens with our heads cut off running around in different directions, the progressive wing and the establishment wing, and Democrats in, you know, different parts of the country, and they're all running different campaigns, different messaging and everything. I'm talking about a coalesced, like moving as a movement in one direction that is piercing through, that is not just sitting on the surface like a snowshoe. We are piercing through because we are focused as a movement, and we're putting our force into that small point that is focused to actually make an impact on the national conversation and on the policy. And I think that I have a good prescription for that. The reason that I keep pushing it off is because I work full-time, stuff pops up, and that stream I want to actually, like, I want to put together my thoughts. I don't want to waste time and meander all over the place. I want to have like basically like a script that I run through with like a very easy to follow, like logic, like not logical, but like easy to follow thread line of what, you know, what these categories of things that I'm talking about, you know, nice bullet points, and you get what I'm trying to say. So I will. I don't think I'll do it today either. I'll probably push it off another week. I'm sorry, but I want it to actually be good. I don't want to just shit it out. Okay. So, and besides, I have no obligation to you. I don't have any actual, like, none of you are paying me. Okay. Pay me. And then maybe we can put some actual deadlines into things. Okay. Until then, you know, it's your guys' faults for not like, sharing, and subscribing. Okay. I blame you. It's your fault. It's not my fault. All right. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.